Constantinople, 565 AD. An old man is awake at 3 in the morning, not because he cannot sleep. He has never needed much sleep. For 40 years. The people who served him called him the emperor who never sleeps. And they did not mean it as a compliment. They meant it the way you describe something that unsettles you. Something that does not operate by the same rules as everything else. He is 83 years old. He is the most powerful man in the world. And he is alone in the largest palace ever built, arguing with a piece of paper about the nature of God. Hagia Sophia stands in the dark a short distance away. He built it. 5 years. 10,000 workers. A mathematical understanding of light and stone that the ancient world had never seen. When it was finished, he walked into it and said, out loud, to a king who had been dead for 1,500 years, Solomon, I have surpassed you. He was not being arrogant. He genuinely believed it was true. His legal code is running in courtrooms across 3 continents. He rewrote the entire foundation of Roman law in 14 months. Most people said it could not be done. He did not find that argument interesting. His armies took back North Africa. Then, Italy, Rome itself, the city, the idea, the thing that the world had decided was simply gone, was his for a moment. His generals walked through streets that no Roman emperor had controlled in 100 years, by every measure that history uses to decide who mattered. Justinian is one of the most successful rulers who ever lived, and he is sitting alone at 3 in the morning because there is no one left who will sit with him long enough to finish the argument. His wife has been dead for 17 years. His greatest general died a few months ago, broken in ways that Justinian was not innocent of. The empire that carries his name is exhausted in ways that do not show up on maps. And Italy, the Italy he bled an entire generation to reclaim for Rome, will fall to invaders 3 years after he dies. He almost brought Rome back. He almost did. This is the story of what almost cost. What does it cost to be the kind of person who cannot stop? Not because stopping would be wrong, but because stopping, for some people, is simply not available as an option. The project is too large. The conviction is too complete. The distance between what is and what should be is too visible to someone who has spent their entire life seeing it. Justinian was that kind of person. He built the most durable legal code in human history. He built the building that is still standing in Istanbul today. He almost brought Rome back together. Almost. Chapter 1. The Boy from the Edge of the World. There is a village in the Western Balkans that does not appear in most histories of the Byzantine Empire. It sits in a region the Romans called Dardania, in territory that is today part of North Macedonia or Kosovo, depending on which map you are looking at and which century you are standing in. The village is small enough that the sources disagree on its name. The boy born there sometime around 482 AD is not disagreed upon. His name was Petrus Sabatius. He would change it later, taking his uncle's family name, becoming Justinianus. But before he was Justinian, before he was Augustus, before he was the man who would argue with Solomon and mean it, he was a boy from a village that the empire barely knew existed. This matters more than it sounds. The Byzantine Empire in the late 400s was the eastern half of something that used to be whole. The western half, the half that contained Rome itself, had collapsed in 476 when a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor and did not bother to replace him. What remained in the east was an empire that called itself Roman, governed from Constantinople, spoke Greek in its streets and its courts. and carried the memory of a unified world it had not actually inhabited for generations. The boy from Dardania grew up on the edge of this world, not the glamorous edge, not the military frontier where soldiers held back invaders and wrote letters home that historians would later find interesting, the quiet edge, the provincial edge, the edge where the empire's presence was felt primarily through tax collectors and the occasional military conscription, and the distant fact that somewhere far away, someone was technically in charge. His family spoke Latin, not the polished Latin of the Roman Senate, not the Latin of Cicero and legal argument and classical education, the Latin of people for whom the Roman world had always been something that happened to them rather than something they participated in. They were farmers. They were Illyrian in origin, which meant they came from a population that Rome had absorbed centuries ago and then largely forgotten about. The boy grew up knowing he was inside the empire but not of it. That distinction, absorbed before he had words for it, would define everything he did for the rest of his life. His uncle Justin changed the trajectory. Justin was everything that the empire's official story said was impossible. He had come to Constantinople as a young man with nothing, joined the army, survived, distinguished himself, and climbed, not quickly, not through connection or inheritance or the right family name, through the slow, grinding accumulation of competence in a system that occasionally, reluctantly, rewarded competence regardless of origin. By 518, Justin was the commander of the palace guard. When the emperor Anastasius died without a clear successor, Justin found himself in the right room at the right moment. The details of exactly how he became emperor are disputed by sources who each had reasons to tell the story differently. What is not disputed is that a man who had been born in a Balkan village and could barely read had somehow ended up on the throne of the Roman world. He brought his nephew to Constantinople. Justinian arrived in a city that was, by any measure, available to a boy from Dardania. Incomprehensible. Constantinople in the early 500s was home to perhaps 500,000 people. It sat on a narrow peninsula where Europe pressed against Asia, where the Bosphorus connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, where every trade route that mattered in the known world passed through or near. The wealth was visible everywhere, and the poverty was visible everywhere, and the distance between the two was not measured in miles, but in something more precise and more final. The Hippodrome seated 100,000 people. The imperial palace complex was a city within the city, a layered accumulation of audience halls and throne rooms and private gardens and administrative offices that had been growing and changing for 200 years. The churches were larger than anything the boy had seen. The markets were louder. The political intrigues were more numerous and more lethal, and conducted with a casualness that suggested everyone involved had long ago made peace with the possibility of a sudden ending. Justinian looked at all of it and did not see wealth or power or spectacle. He saw a system that was broken. This is not a romantic interpretation placed on him by later admirers. The evidence of his entire reign points toward a man who had decided, very early, that the world he had been placed into was not functioning the way it was supposed to function. The law contradicted itself. The church was divided by disputes that had been running for a century without resolution. The western territories that Rome was supposed to govern were in the hands of people who were not Roman. The empire called itself the continuation of something it had clearly lost the thread of. Other people saw this and accepted it as the natural condition of things. Empires decay. The world changes. You govern what you can with what you have. Justinian appears to have found this response genuinely unacceptable. He was educated in Constantinople at his uncle's expense, not the education of a man being prepared for a specific role, but the education of a man trying to understand everything: law, theology, history, military strategy, architecture, administration. He read with the focused intensity of someone who believes that if you understand a system completely enough, you can fix it. He argued with scholars and clergy and administrators, not to win arguments, but to find the places where the arguments revealed structural problems. He was not charming in the way that courts value charm. He was not socially graceful. The sources suggest he was intense in conversations, to the point of making people uncomfortable. The kind of person who treats a casual dinner discussion about theology as an opportunity to identify every logical inconsistency in the other person's position. But he was learning something that no amount of formal education could have given him. He was learning the difference between how the empire presented itself and how it actually worked. Justin was emperor. Justin had power. Justin could issue decrees and command armies and receive ambassadors from foreign kingdoms who came with gifts and carefully worded requests. And Justin, for all his genuine capability as a military man and a political survivor, did not entirely understand the machinery he was now responsible for operating. Justinian understood it. Or rather, he was in the process of understanding it, in the way that only someone who has both access to the machinery and distance from it can understand. He was close enough to see how decisions were actually made, which was rarely the way the official version described. He was distant enough from the assumption that the current arrangement was natural and correct to see where the machinery was grinding against itself. He watched. He read. He argued. He waited. The waiting was not passive. It never was with Justinian. While Justin sat on the throne and handled the daily business of empire with the pragmatic common sense of a soldier who had survived by reading situations accurately, his nephew was doing something that looked like nothing in particular, and was actually the construction of a complete picture of everything that needed to be repaired. The law needed to be rebuilt from its foundation. 1,000 years of Roman legal tradition had accumulated into a mass of contradictions so dense that two courts could reach opposite conclusions about the same case, and both be technically correct. This was not a minor administrative problem. This was a civilization that had lost the ability to say clearly what it believed about justice. The church needed to be unified. The dispute between Chalcedonian and Miaphysite Christianity had been running since 451 and showed no signs of resolution. It was not merely a theological disagreement. It was a fracture that ran along geographic and political lines, dividing the empire's population in ways that emperors kept trying to manage and kept failing to resolve. The Western territories needed to be recovered, not because maps mattered in themselves, but because the idea that Rome was still Rome required Rome to actually be Roman. An empire that called itself the continuation of the greatest civilization in history, while accepting that the city of Rome itself was governed by Ostrogoths, was making a claim that its own geography contradicted. These were not three separate problems. In Justinian's understanding, they were the same problem seen from three different angles. Rome was broken. Broken in its law. Broken in its faith. Broken in its physical extent. And a broken Rome could not be what he believed Rome was supposed to be. He was somewhere in his 30s by the time this understanding was fully formed. He was not yet emperor. He would not be emperor for another decade. He had no formal authority to begin any of the repairs he could see were needed. What he had was time, and the specific, patient kind of attention that accumulates into knowledge that cannot be learned any other way. Justin grew older. The nephew who had arrived as a boy from a village that did not appear in most histories of the empire had become the person without whom the empire could not actually function. Not through ambition performed visibly, through the quiet, relentless accumulation of competence and understanding until the system depended on him more than it knew. He was not waiting for his turn. He was preparing for the repair. The world he had been born into was broken. He was going to fix it. He had not yet discovered what fixing it would cost. Chapter 2. The Mind Behind the Throne. Power has two faces. The first face is the one everyone can see. The throne, the crown, the ceremonial robes, the audience hall where foreign ambassadors prostrate themselves and officials speak in careful, measured language, because the wrong word in the wrong moment can end a career or a life. This is the face that history tends to photograph. The visible surface of authority, the part that gets recorded in official documents and carved into stone. The second face is the one that actually runs things. For the better part of a decade before he became emperor, Justinian lived entirely inside the second face. He had no crown. He had no throne. He had something more useful than either. He had the complete, unobstructed view of how the most powerful institution in the world actually operated when it thought no one important was watching. Justin was emperor in the full ceremonial sense. He sat in the kathisma above the hippodrome and received the crowd's noise as communication. He signed documents. He received ambassadors. He made decisions about military appointments and territorial disputes and the 1,000 daily questions that an empire generates simply by existing. He did all of this with the pragmatic competence of a man who had survived 60 years of difficult circumstances by reading situations accurately and responding without hesitation. But Justin could not draft a legal argument. He could not construct a theological position sophisticated enough to engage the scholars and bishops who needed to be managed. He could not design an administrative reform from its conceptual foundation to its practical implementation across a dozen provinces simultaneously. He was a man of genuine capability, operating an instrument of extraordinary complexity, and the gap between his capability and the instrument's demands was filled, quietly and completely, by his nephew. Justinian drafted the correspondence that Justin signed. Justinian received the officials that Justin could not fully evaluate and reported back with assessments that shaped the decisions Justin then made. Justinian sat in the meetings where policy was actually formed, not the ceremonial audiences where policy was announced, and understood the difference between what was being said and what was being decided. This education was worth more than any palace upbringing could have provided. A man who grows up as the heir to power grows up inside its assumptions. He learns the system from the position of someone who belongs to it, which means he learns it in the way that makes the system's current shape seem natural and correct. The machinery works the way it works because that is how the machinery works. The alternative arrangements are theoretical. The actual arrangement is simply reality. Justinian learned it differently. He learned it as someone who had arrived from outside, who had no inherited stake in the current arrangement being preserved, who could see the gap between what the system claimed to be doing and what it was actually doing, precisely because he had not spent his childhood being told the gap did not exist. What he saw was not encouraging. The legal system was the most immediate problem. Justinian had been studying Roman law since his arrival in Constantinople, and the more he studied it, the more clearly he could see what centuries of accumulated additions and modifications and contradictions had produced. There were laws on the books that directly contradicted other laws on the books. There were imperial constitutions from different centuries that said opposite things about the same legal question. There were juristic opinions from the great Roman legal scholars of previous centuries that were treated as authoritative, but that disagreed with each other on fundamental matters. A judge in Constantinople, trying a property dispute in 520 could, depending on which sources he chose to cite, reach a verdict in either direction and justify it entirely from existing law. The law was not a foundation, it was a fog, and a civilization that cannot say clearly what it believes about justice is a civilization that has lost something essential about itself, something that no military victory or architectural achievement can replace. The Church was a different kind of problem, but the same kind of damage. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 had declared the official position of the Christian Church on the nature of Christ. It was a careful, philosophically precise formulation that satisfied the theological tradition centered in Constantinople and Rome. It also failed completely to satisfy the theological tradition of Egypt, Syria, and large parts of the Eastern Empire, which held to a different understanding that Constantinople called heresy and those communities called truth. This was not a small disagreement about interpretive details. It was a fracture that ran through the empire's religious identity and expressed itself in political tension, in periodic persecution, in the constant, low-level friction of an institution claiming unity it did not possess. Emperors before Justin had tried various approaches to the problem. They had issued compromise formulas that satisfied no one. They had enforced one position by suppressing the other, and then reversed course when the suppression created more instability than the disagreement. They had managed the fracture without healing it, which meant they had kept the wound open while pretending it was closing. Justinian watched all of this and formed his own view. Not a diplomatic view, not a view designed to manage the problem within acceptable limits. A view about what would actually fix it, which was a different kind of view entirely, and required a different kind of willingness to impose. He also watched something more personal. He watched what happened to the people who ran the administrative machinery of the empire at every level from the palace to the provinces. He watched the tax collectors who extracted revenue with methods that bore little relationship to the rates officially prescribed. He watched the provincial governors who accumulated personal wealth through the systematic exploitation of the populations they were theoretically protecting. He watched the court officials who sold access and influence and appointments with a casualness that suggested they had never seriously considered whether they were doing anything wrong. The corruption was not exceptional. It was structural. It was what the system produced when left to itself. Because the system had not been designed with sufficient clarity about what it was actually supposed to do. An empire built on contradictory law and administered by officials whose personal enrichment was tolerated as long as they maintained surface functionality was an empire that was eating itself from the inside. He filed all of this away, not with the anger of a reformer who has just discovered injustice, with the cold, methodical attention of an engineer who is cataloguing the points of failure in a structure he intends to rebuild. It was during these years behind the throne that he met the people who would make his reign possible. Tribonian was a lawyer of exceptional intelligence, a man whose understanding of Roman legal tradition was comprehensive enough to see both its brilliance and its catastrophic incoherence. He was also, if Procopius is to be believed even partially, a man who found the line between legal service and personal enrichment flexible in ways that caused real harm to real people. He was brilliant and compromised in the specific combination that the Byzantine world produced with uncomfortable regularity. Justinian saw his capability and decided it was sufficient for the purpose. Belisarius was something rarer, a military commander who understood not just tactics, but the deeper logic of what made armies function and fail. He was from the Balkans, like Justinian, which was either coincidence or a reflection of something Justinian had come to believe about men formed at the empire's edge. He was loyal in the way that very capable people are loyal when they have found someone worth following. not from obligation, but from the recognition that this particular person understands what needs to be done and has the will to do it. Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus were different kinds of minds entirely. Anthemius was a mathematician who thought about physical space with a precision that had no obvious practical application until Justinian gave him one. Isidore was a physicist and teacher whose understanding of structural engineering contained possibilities that no one had yet built. Justinian looked at these two men and saw something that was not yet a building. And then there was Theodora. She does not fit neatly into the category of useful people Justinian was assembling. She is not reducible to what she contributed to his plans, because what she contributed was not a skill or an expertise or a capability that could be itemized. What she contributed was something that the entire apparatus of Justinian's intelligence could not manufacture for itself. He was, for all his extraordinary analytical capability, a man who understood systems better than he understood the people inside them. He could read a legal text with perfect clarity. He could identify the structural failures of an administrative arrangement with the precision of a diagnostician. He could design the conceptual architecture of a reform that would have to be implemented by thousands of officials across millions of people over decades. What he could not do, not naturally, not without effort, was walk into a room and know within the first few minutes which of the people in it were telling the truth. Not in the simple sense of detecting lies, in the deeper sense of reading what people were actually afraid of, what they actually wanted, what they would actually do when the moment came, and the official version of their loyalty was tested by circumstances that made disloyalty seem survivable. Theodora could do this. She had been doing it since childhood. She had grown up in the hippodrome world, in the performance world, in the world of people who had no formal standing and therefore survived entirely by reading the room with a precision that formal standing made unnecessary. She had spent years in spaces where the gap between what people presented and what they intended was the most important thing in the room. And she had developed an accuracy about that gap that no education and no analytical intelligence could replicate. She was the thing his intelligence had been missing. Justinian recognized this. Not immediately. Perhaps not in the first conversation or the first month, but at some point, and clearly enough that he did something that the law of the empire said he could not do. He decided that this particular person was not replaceable. The law said a man of senatorial rank could not marry a woman of the performance class. The infames, the law called them, the infamous, people whose profession placed them outside the dignities and protections that respectable society extended to respectable citizens. Justinian went to his uncle and asked him to change the law. Justin's wife Euphemia refused to support it. She understood what the court would do with an empress who carried that past, how the vulnerability would never fully disappear, how every enemy Justinian made would have a weapon that could not be blunted by achievement or authority. She was not wrong about any of that. She died before the matter was resolved. After she was gone, Justin issued the decree. The law changed. Not loudly, not with the language of romantic exception, with the careful, general language of imperial legislation that technically applied to any woman who had left the performance world and wished to be rehabilitated in the eyes of the law. Everyone understood exactly what it meant. Justinian married Theodora. The court watched this and recalibrated, not with open hostility, which would have been suicidal, with the careful internal adjustment that institutions make when they realize the assumptions they have been operating under are no longer accurate. The man who was going to be the next emperor had just demonstrated two things simultaneously. First, that he was willing to spend political capital to get what he believed was right, even when what he believed was right made the people around him deeply uncomfortable. Second, that his judgment about what mattered was not going to be shaped by their preferences. These were useful things to know about the man who was about to inherit the world. Justin died in August of 527. He had been ill for some time. The transition had been prepared so carefully, so thoroughly, that it felt less like the death of an emperor and more like the completion of an administrative handover that had been in process for years. Justinian became emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. He was approximately 45 years old. He had been watching, learning, cataloging, and preparing for this moment since he had arrived in Constantinople as a boy from a village that most histories do not mention. He had identified every major structural failure in the civilization he was now responsible for. He had assembled the people he believed could help him fix them. He had secured beside him the one person he had decided he could not govern without. He did not ascend to the throne the way men ascend to things they have been waiting to receive. He ascended the way a person sits down at a problem they have been working on for 30 years, and finally has the authority to solve. The question that he had not yet asked himself, not seriously, not with the honesty it deserved, was this: what if some things cannot be solved? What if the world does not repair the way a legal text repairs, or a building repairs, or an argument repairs when you find the correct formulation? What if the thing he had spent 30 years preparing to fix was not actually broken in the ways he thought? He did not ask these questions in 527. He had work to do. Chapter 3. Rewriting the Foundation. The first thing Justinian did as emperor was not what anyone expected. He did not launch a military campaign. He did not purge the court of his uncle's allies and replace them with his own. He did not make the grand ceremonial gestures that new emperors traditionally made to establish the emotional register of their reign. He did not even address the most visible political tensions that had been building during Justin's final years. He called in the lawyers. Specifically, he summoned Tribonian, gave him a team of 10 men, and issued an instruction that the legal world of the Byzantine Empire had never heard before and did not quite know how to process. He told them to go through every law that the Roman world had produced across centuries of imperial constitutions, juristic opinions, contradiction, repetitions, and obsolete rules, and produce from that mass of accumulated contradiction a single coherent legal code. One code, no contradiction, no obsoleta provisions, no cases where two legitimate authorities said opposite things about the same question. He gave them 14 months. The legal scholars who heard about this project had a range of reactions, and none of them was enthusiasm. The task was not simply large. It was, by the standards of what had been attempted before, essentially impossible. Previous emperors had tried to organize Roman law. Theodosius II had produced a code in 438 that collected imperial constitutions going back to Constantine. It was a genuine achievement. It had also done almost nothing to resolve the deeper contradictions in the juristic tradition. The centuries of legal opinions from the great Roman jurists, whose writings carried the force of law and who frequently disagreed with each other about matters of fundamental importance. The problem was not that no one had tried to organize the law before. The problem was that organizing it required making decisions that no one had been willing to make. When two authoritative legal texts said opposite things, a compiler had three choices. He could include both and leave the contradiction for judges to navigate, which was what previous codes had done. He could arbitrarily choose one and discard the other, which required a kind of authority that felt uncomfortable to exercise over texts that had been treated as sacred for centuries. Or he could find the principle underlying both, determine which one more accurately expressed that principle, and construct a rule that resolved the contradiction by understanding it rather than simply picking a side. The third approach was the only one that actually fixed anything. It was also the only one that required someone to understand the entire legal tradition well enough to see what it was trying to say beneath the accumulated weight of its own contradictions. Tribonian understood it that well, and Justinian, who had been studying Roman law since his arrival in Constantinople, understood it well enough to know that Tribonian understood it. What followed was one of the most concentrated acts of intellectual reconstruction in the history of any civilization. In 14 months, Tribonian's team produced the Codex Justinianus, a collection of imperial constitutions organized by subject and stripped of redundancy and contradiction. This was the first volume. The second volume, the Digest, was more ambitious and more important. It drew from the writings of 39 Roman jurists spanning 5 centuries, extracted the legal principles from those writings, reconciled the contradictions, and organized the results into 50 books covering every area of Roman law. The third volume, the Institutes, was a textbook for law students, a clear and systematic introduction to the principles that the first 2 volumes embodied. A fourth volume, a revised codex, incorporated the legal changes Justinian had made since the first version. The entire project is known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It would become the foundation of the legal systems of France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Scotland, and nearly every country in Latin America. When Napoleon commissioned the Napoleonic Code in 1804, his legal scholars worked from Justinian's text. When the American founders thought about the nature of law and the structure of civil society, they were thinking in categories that Justinian's lawyers had organized. The legal language that most of the modern world uses to think about property, contract, inheritance, obligation, and justice traces directly back to a team of 10 men working under impossible pressure in Constantinople in the early 500s. Justinian understood none of this, because he could not see the future. What he understood was what he was trying to do, plain, which was to make Rome legible to itself. Again, Rome had always been, in his understanding, an idea as much as a territory. The idea was that civilization was not chaos organized by force. It was order, organized by principle. The law was how the principle expressed itself. If the law was incoherent, if it contradicted itself, if it could be read to mean opposite things by equally competent judges, then the principle had been lost and only the force remained. And an empire held together only by force was not Rome. It was something that wore Rome's name without understanding what the name meant. This is why the legal project came first. Not because it was the most urgent problem in a conventional political sense, because it was the foundation. You could not rebuild a civilization on contradictory ground. You had to establish what the civilization actually believed before you could extend it, defend it, or ask anyone else to live inside it. There was, however, a problem that Justinian was aware of and chose not to resolve before proceeding. Tribonian was, by multiple contemporary accounts, including those of people who had no particular reason to invent the charge, a man who used his position to enrich himself. Procopius accused him of corruption, specifically of allowing legal outcomes to be shaped by private payment. The charges against Procopius as a source are real and they matter. He was a man with deep personal animus toward the people he was writing about in his secret work, and his characterizations should never be taken as simple fact, but the accusation itself reveals something that the corpus juris civilis does not. The man who rewrote the foundation of Roman law was operating inside the same compromised system that the law was supposed to clean up. Procopius accused Tribonian of corruption, and whether every charge was fair or not. The accusation itself reveals the world. Justinian was trying to govern brilliant on paper, compromised in practice. The brilliant and the corrupt were not separate populations in Justinian's empire. They were frequently the same person. Justinian knew this. He was not naive about the people he worked with. He was pragmatic in the specific way that someone becomes pragmatic when they have decided that the goal matters more than the purity of the instrument. He needed Tribonian's mind. Tribonian's mind came with Tribonian's moral flexibility. The alternative was a more honest man, producing a less useful result. And Justinian found that trade unacceptable. This was not a small decision. It was the first visible expression of something that would run through his entire reign, like a fault line beneath an apparently solid surface. Justinian was building toward an ideal. He was building with the materials that actually existed. And the materials that actually existed were never quite as good as the ideal required. He filed this away and kept working. The corpus juris civilis went out into the empire with the authority of imperial decree behind it. Judges were required to use it. Legal scholars were required to teach from it. The centuries of accumulated contradiction were officially, legally, permanently set aside. Rome had spoken clearly about what it believed, perhaps for the first time in hundreds of years. On paper, the foundation had been repaired. In the courtrooms and administrative offices and provincial governments where the law actually operated, the people implementing it were the same people who had always implemented it. The corruption that Justinian had observed during his years behind the throne did not disappear because a better legal text was available. It adapted. It found the gaps in the new code the same way it had found the gaps in the old one. It continued to function because the people running it had not changed. Justinian saw this clearly. He responded by working harder, issuing more decrees, adding more specific provisions to close specific gaps as he identified them. He would spend his entire reign in a continuous effort to make the law do what he believed law should do, issuing hundreds of additional decrees called novels that refined and extended the corpus in response to problems as they emerged. It was the behavior of a man who believed that if you found exactly the right formulation, the system would finally work the way it was supposed to work. He had not yet seriously entertained the possibility that the formulation was not the problem. Outside the palace, the empire continued its ordinary business. Officials administered, tax collectors collected, courts adjudicated, merchants traded. The hippodrome filled on race days with 100,000 people who organized their passion around the blues and the greens, and expressed in that passion everything they felt about the government above them that they had no other formal way to address. The blues and the greens had been part of Constantinople's life for as long as Constantinople had been Constantinople. They were nominally the fan organizations of the two chariot racing teams that dominated the hippodrome. They were actually something considerably more complex. They had leadership structures and funding networks and the ability to mobilize large numbers of people in coordinated action. They had wealthy patrons who used them as instruments of political influence. They controlled sections of the city in ways that the official government tolerated because the alternative, direct confrontation, had historically been more trouble than the tolerance cost, Justinian decided to constrain them. This was the correct policy. The blues and the greens needed to understand that the law applied to them. The official legal code he had just produced was not intended to describe a world in which certain organized groups were exempt from its operation. Consistency was not merely an administrative preference. That was the point. What Justinian did not fully account for was the timing. He was attempting to impose legal accountability on the factions at the same moment that his chief financial administrator, a man named John the Cappadocian, was extracting tax revenue from the empire's population with a thoroughness that bordered on systematic devastation. John was extraordinarily effective at finding money and moving it to where Justinian needed it. He was equally effective at generating the kind of resentment that does not express itself in political argument because political argument is not available, and so accumulates instead, quietly and without visible form, until it finds a moment when the calculation of speaking changes. The law was clear. The law was newly clarified. In fact, the law said the factions were subject to it. The city was full of people who had been waiting for a moment when the calculation changed. Justinian was about to give them that moment, entirely without intending to. He was sitting at his desk, working, because he was always working. When the winter of 532 arrived, he had repaired the foundation of Rome on paper. He was about to discover what the paper was worth when the city outside decided it had something to say. Chapter 4. The City on Fire. January 532. The first thing you need to understand about what happened that month is that it did not begin as a revolution. It began as a Tuesday in the Hippodrome, which meant 100,000 people packed into tiered stone seats above a racing track, organized by faction, separated by the invisible but clearly understood boundaries that governed where blues sat and where greens sat, and what happened when someone crossed the wrong line at the wrong moment. The emperor was in his box above it all, the Kathisma, connected to the palace by a private corridor so he could appear before his people without having to walk among them. The races ran. The crowd made noise. The afternoon had the ordinary texture of ordinary hippodrome days. Then something shifted. The government had recently arrested several members of both factions for crimes committed during previous disturbances. Some had been executed. Others were scheduled to be. Two of them, one blue and one green, had survived botched executions through what the crowd interpreted as divine intervention and were sheltering in a church claiming sanctuary. The government was trying to decide what to do about this. The decision was taking longer than it should have. In a city where the Hippodrome was the only place ordinary people could communicate directly with imperial power, delay read as weakness, and weakness. In a population that had been absorbing tax pressure and faction violence and the accumulated friction of a government that was simultaneously very ambitious and very demanding, was not something that stayed uninterpreted for long. The factions began chanting together. This was the detail that should have told everyone in the imperial box that what was happening was not normal. Blues and greens did not chant together. They were organized specifically around opposition to each other. Their identity was built on that opposition. The moments when they set it aside were the moments when something else had become more important than the usual divisions. What they were chanting was a single word, Nika, victory. Not victory for one faction over the other. Victory over the government. Victory over Justinian. Victory over John, the Cappadocian, and the tax collectors, and the officials who had decided that the factions were subject to law while the empire's financial demands on ordinary people continued without limit or mercy. The races stopped. The crowd poured into the streets. The fires started that night. Justinian had faced difficult situations before. He had navigated the treacherous political waters of Justin's reign. He had managed the court's resistance to his marriage. He had dealt with the ordinary friction of governing an empire that was large and diverse and full of competing interests. He was not a man who frightened easily. What happened over the next 5 days was different from anything he had encountered. The fires spread through the city in ways that defied the normal logic of urban fire. The area around the Hippodrome burned. The original Hagia Sophia burned. The public baths burned. The administrative buildings that housed the records and machinery of the empire's daily governance burned. The smoke over Constantinople was visible from across the Bosphorus. The smell of it was everywhere. The sound of the city in those days was not the sound of a city that was frightened. It was the sound of a city that had decided it was done being frightened. Justinian ran his government from inside the palace complex, which remained physically secure even as everything outside it was coming apart. He sent troops. The troops were insufficient. He negotiated. The crowd was not in a mood for the kind of negotiation where both sides returned to approximately where they had started. He tried to appear in the Hippodrome, to address the crowd directly, to use the imperial presence as it was traditionally supposed to function. The crowd was not moved. On the 5th day, the situation clarified into something that had a name. The crowd in the Hippodrome had found a candidate. His name was Hypatius, and he was the nephew of a previous emperor, Anastasius, which meant he carried a bloodline claim to the throne that was more than merely symbolic. He was not an impressive man by most accounts. He was not a military commander of distinction or a political mind of particular sharpness, but he was present, and he was available, and he was not Justinian. And in January of 532, in Constantinople, those 3 qualities were sufficient to dress a man in purple and carry him to the Hippodrome and declare him emperor with something that resembled constitutional standing. There were now 2 emperors. Inside the palace, Justinian gathered his council. These were not weak men or foolish men. They were the senior military commanders and administrators of the most powerful empire in the world. They had experience and capability and a collective understanding of how situations like this one had played out historically. And what they told Justinian, with the careful, precise logic of people who had thought the situation through from multiple angles, was this: leave. The ships were ready. The treasury could be loaded. The imperial family and the court could be on the water before the crowd in the Hippodrome had finished celebrating. Justinian could go to one of the other imperial territories, regroup, rebuild, return when the circumstances were more favorable. This was not cowardice. This was the kind of strategic withdrawal that Byzantine political history had occasionally validated. Emperors had survived by retreating and returning. Justinian could survive the same way. He was listening to this, not agreeing, not yet, but listening in the way that an exhausted man listens to an argument that is coherent and has the advantage of being safe. Theodora spoke. What she said has been preserved by Procopius, which means it has been shaped by a man who simultaneously respected its power and resented its source. The literary Greek of his formal history gives it the cadences of a classical oration. The actual words she spoke in that room were almost certainly less polished and more direct. But the substance of what Procopius records is consistent with everything else we know about how she thought and what she valued. She said she did not want to flee. That she agreed with the ancient saying that the imperial purple was the noblest shroud, that if the emperor wished to save himself, The ships were there, and the sea was open, but she would not leave. Not because she was unafraid, but because she had made a calculation. The kind of calculation that she was better at making than anyone else in that room. And the calculation had come out the same way, regardless of how many times she ran it. Then she stopped speaking. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of people waiting for someone else to speak. The quiet of people who have just heard something that has changed the shape of the moment and are processing what that means for the decision they were about to make. Justinian did not speak either. Not immediately. The sources do not record what passed across his face or what he thought in the space between her words and his decision. We have the before and the after. The interior of that moment belongs entirely to him and to the people who were in that room, and who did not write it down in a way that survived. What we know is what happened next. He stood up. He gave the order. He sent Belisarius and a commander named Narses into the hippodrome with the forces that were available. The hippodrome had one entrance into the arena from the palace side. Belisarius took it. Narses and his forces came through a different entrance. The crowd inside, which had been chanting and celebrating and watching Hypatius in his improvised purple, found itself suddenly enclosed by soldiers who had not come to negotiate. What happened in the hippodrome that afternoon was not a battle. Battles have two sides that are both capable of fighting. What happened was something more like a closing. The ancient sources give numbers that vary enough to suggest that no one who was counting Narsa. Perhaps tens of thousands of people died. The hippodrome, which had held the voice of Constantinople for centuries, held something else by the time the day was over. Hypatius was captured. He told Justinian he had been taken by the crowd against his will, that he had not sought the purple, that he was a victim of circumstances. Maybe. The historical record does not resolve this cleanly. What the historical record does tell us is that Justinian had him executed the following day, along with his brother, not because the evidence against them was overwhelming, because the existence of a man with a bloodline claim to the throne who had worn purple, even briefly, even under protest, was a fact that could not be safely left in the world. The Nika riots were over. Constantinople, in the days that followed, had the specific quality of a city that has survived something it did not expect to survive and is not entirely sure how to feel about that. The fires were being dealt with. The bodies in the hippodrome were being dealt with. The administrative machinery of the empire, which had continued to function in a reduced and dislocated way even during the worst days, resumed its normal operations with the determined efficiency of a system that needed to pretend the interruption had been less severe than it was. Justinian looked at what the week had cost. The physical damage was extensive but repairable. The political damage was more complicated. He had survived, but the survival had required killing tens of thousands of his own people in the place where his own people went to speak to him. The relationship between an emperor and his city is never simple, but it is usually not this. The first thing Justinian learned as emperor was that law could organize an empire on paper. It could not calm a crowd that had already decided the paper did not matter. And here is where the man becomes visible beneath the emperor. A different kind of ruler might have spent the weeks after Nika in something like reflection, in some engagement with the question of what the riots had revealed about the relationship between his government and the people it governed, in some reconsideration of John the Cappadocian's methods, or the pace of reform, or the accumulated pressure that had turned an ordinary Tuesday into 5 days of fire. Justinian spent the weeks after Nika designing a building, not as an escape from what had happened. As an answer to it, he had seen. In January of 532, what happened when the people of Constantinople did not feel that the world around them reflected anything worth preserving. He had seen a city tear itself apart because the abstractions of law and administration and imperial authority had failed to produce the thing that human beings actually need from the civilization they live inside. He was going to build something that could not be argued with, something that spoke not to the legal mind or the political calculation, but to the part of a person that existed before either of those things, something that walked into a room and did not make an argument, something that simply was. He had a mathematician and a physicist and a vision of what light could do inside a space if you understood both subjects well enough to make them cooperate. He had the ruins of the old Hagia Sophia, burned in the riots. As the site, he had Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus waiting for instructions. He gave them the instructions. The first stone of the new Hagia Sophia was laid in February of 532. The city that had burned in January was already building something that would still be standing 1,500 years later. He was building something that the Hippodrome could not touch. Simple tyrants kill people because they can and move on. Justinian killed people because he believed he was building something that would outlast the killing and justify the cost. He was not entirely wrong. That is the part that does not resolve. Chapter 5. Building Heaven on Earth. There is a specific kind of light that exists inside Hagia Sophia that does not exist anywhere else on Earth. It is not the light of a building. It is not the light that comes through windows and falls in recognizable patterns on recognizable surfaces, the way light behaves in ordinary rooms. The architects who designed it, a mathematician named Anthemius of Tralles and a physicist named Isidore of Miletus, understood something about the relationship between light and space that had never been applied at this scale before. They designed the windows not to let light in, but to make light appear to have no source. 40 windows arranged around the base of the dome, each one calculated so that the light entering them merges before it reaches the eye, so that standing inside and looking up, you see illumination without origin, brightness without direction, a dome that appears to float above you, untethered to the walls below it. Procopius, who was not a sentimental man, wrote that the dome seemed to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. He was not being poetic. He was describing what he actually saw, what everyone who walked into that space for the first time actually saw, something that did not behave the way buildings behaved, something that made the familiar laws of how light and stone and space interact temporarily unavailable as explanatory tools. Justinian built this deliberately. Every element of it was calculated. The dome's diameter, the placement of the windows, the curve of the half-domes that distributed the structural load and opened the interior space in ways that had never been attempted, the relationship between the height of the walls and the width of the nave. None of it was accidental, and none of it was purely aesthetic. It was engineering in the service of a specific psychological and theological effect. He wanted people to walk in and feel, before they thought anything, that they were somewhere that did not follow the rules of the world outside. He spent 5 years and 10,000 workers achieving this. The construction of Hagia Sophia between 532 and 537 is one of the more extraordinary sustained acts of organized human effort in the historical record. The materials came from across the empire and beyond it. Columns of green marble from Thessaly, columns of yellow marble from North Africa, porphyry from Egypt, the purple stone that had been the exclusive material of imperial identity for centuries, white marble from the islands of the Aegean. Anthemius and Isidore worked from mathematical principles rather than from precedent, because the precedents did not exist for what they were trying to build. When structural problems arose, as they inevitably did, When you are attempting to place a dome of unprecedented size on walls that no existing engineering tradition had been designed to support, they solved them with calculations rather than by reference to what had been done before. The dome cracked during construction. They rebuilt it with a shallower curve that distributed the load differently. The new curve was structurally superior to the original design. The failure made the building better. Justinian watched all of this with the attention of someone who understood what was being built, not just architecturally but symbolically. This was not a church in the way that previous churches had been churches. Functional spaces for liturgical practice, decorated in proportion to the wealth and ambition of their patrons. This was something else. This was the physical argument that Constantinople was the center of the Christian world, that the emperor who built it was the instrument of divine will, that God and Rome and the faith that Justinian believed should unify both were all pointing in the same direction. He was also building his answer to Nika. This is the detail that the official accounts of Hagia Sophia tend to minimize. And it is the detail that makes the building emotionally comprehensible as a human act rather than merely as an architectural achievement. Justinian had watched his city burn. He had watched 100,000 people in the Hippodrome reject everything he represented, with a single word repeated, until it became the only sound in the world. He had survived that rejection through the decision that Theodora's words had made possible. And he had maintained his position through the killing that Belisarius and Narses had executed in the Hippodrome. He was now building something that the Hippodrome could not touch. The Hippodrome was the place where the city spoke to power in the language of noise and numbers and collective anger. It was a horizontal space, a space that spread outward, a space organized around the idea that enough people in one place had a kind of force that individual people did not. It was the space of the crowd. The crowd had nearly destroyed him. Hagia Sophia was a vertical space, a space that pulled the eye upward, away from the horizontal world where crowds organized and numbers mattered and collective force could be mobilized, a space where the individual standing inside it was made small not by the presence of other people, but by the presence of something that could not be counted or organized or directed at a political target, a space that produced, in the people who stood inside it, not the energized solidarity of the crowd, but a different and quieter thing. Something closer to awe, something that made political anger feel temporarily beside the point. He understood exactly what he was building. Procopius describes the day of the dedication. December 27th, 537. The ceremonies, the clergy, the chanting, the procession through streets that had been burned 5 years earlier and had since been rebuilt, the gathering of officials and dignitaries and clergy and the ordinary people of Constantinople who pressed as close as they could to witness what their emperor had made from the ruins of what they had burned, and then Justinian walking into the completed building for the first time. He walked through the great doors. He saw what Anthemius and Isidore had made of light and stone and mathematics. He walked to the center of the nave and stood under the dome that appeared to float above him and looked up at the light that had no source. And he said, to no one in particular, to a king who had been dead for 1,500 years, to the silence and the light and the 40 years of effort that had produced the moment he was standing in Solomon. I have surpassed you. He was not performing. He was not speaking for an audience. He was making a statement to a historical record that he believed ran longer than any individual reign, longer than any empire, longer than the political world that had nearly destroyed him 5 years earlier. He was placing himself in a lineage that ran from Solomon's temple through the history of sacred architecture to this building in this city on this morning. And he was saying that the lineage had culminated here. with him, in this. The audacity of it is still breathtaking. 1500 years later, so is the sincerity. That is the specific difficulty of Justinian that Hagia Sophia makes visible more clearly than anything else he built. He was not a man performing greatness for an audience. He was a man who genuinely believed he was doing what the moment in history required. What God required. What Rome required. The certainty was not a mask over ambition. The certainty was real. He genuinely believed that he was the instrument through which a broken world was being repaired, and the building he made from that belief is still standing. 1500 years. Earthquakes that collapsed other structures. Wars that destroyed entire cities. The fall of the empire that built it. The conversion of the building itself from Christian church to Ottoman mosque to secular museum and back to mosque again. Through all of it, the dome that appears to float and the light that has no source have remained exactly as Anthemius and Isidore calculated them. But there is something about Hagia Sophia that the official story of its magnificence tends to skip past. And it sits in the same space as the thing Justinian said when he walked in. He built it to hold something, not physically, spiritually and politically. He built it to be the center of a unified Christian world, the sacred space at the heart of a Rome restored in law and territory and faith. He built it as the place where the argument he was making about what Rome was, and what Christianity was, and what God required of both, would be expressed in the most permanent and undeniable form available to him. The building succeeded completely. The argument failed. The Christian world that Hagia Sophia was built to unify never unified. The theological disputes that Justinian spent his reign trying to resolve by a combination of theological sophistication and imperial pressure continued after him and continued after the empire, and in some forms continue today. The Rome he was restoring in law and territory would begin to unravel within years of his death. The faith he was trying to make singular and coherent would fracture in ways that no building, however magnificent, could contain. What survived was the building, not what he put it there to do. The building itself, he had wanted to make something permanent. He succeeded, but not in the way he intended. What became permanent was the structure, not the meaning he had given it. What became permanent was the light and the floating dome and the specific quality of the silence inside, which has welcomed the prayers of Christians and Muslims and tourists and the simply curious across 15 centuries, sheltering meanings that Justinian did not intend and could not have foreseen. The building surpassed him, not Solomon. The building surpassed Justinian. It went on without him, becoming things he did not design it to be, serving purposes he would not have recognized, outlasting every argument he had with himself in the dark about what it was for. He built it to last. It lasted. Whether that is triumph or tragedy depends entirely on what you think the point was. There was no time to sit with that question in 537. The building was done. The legal code was running. The theological disputes continued without resolution. And, to the west, in the territories that Rome had lost and that Justinian had been watching since before he was emperor, something was happening that demanded his attention. Belisarius was ready. The dream that had been building since a boy from Dardania had first looked at a map of the world Rome used to be and felt the specific dissatisfaction of someone who believes broken things can be fixed. That dream was about to be tested against actual geography and actual people and the actual resistance of a world that had been rearranging itself for a century without waiting for Justinian's permission. He was looking west. The repairs he had made on paper and in stone were real. Now He needed to make them on the map. Chapter 6. The General and the Dream. There is a specific kind of hope that is more dangerous than despair. Despair knows its limits. It does not promise things it cannot deliver. It does not open doors that lead to longer and more expensive corridors. Despair sits with you in the wreckage and tells you the wreckage is what there is. Hope of the kind that Justinian carried into the summer of 533 was different. It was the hope of a man who had already done several things that were not supposed to be possible. He had rewritten the entire foundation of Roman law in 14 months. He had built a structure that made the laws of light behave differently than they behaved anywhere else on earth. He had survived Nika when the sensible thing, the thing that experienced men had recommended with genuine conviction, was to get on a ship and leave. He was developing a relationship with the impossible that was going to cost him considerably. The plan was to send an army across the Mediterranean and take back North Africa from the Vandals. His advisors went through their objections methodically. The Vandals had controlled North Africa for over a century. Their kingdom was stable. Their military was capable. And the sea crossing required to reach them was long enough and unpredictable enough that the logistics alone should have given pause. The empire was still recovering from Nika. The treasury was under pressure from the construction of Hagia Sophia and the ordinary expense of running a government that spanned 3 continents. The eastern frontier with Persia required continuous attention and occasional payment. The available forces were not overwhelming. The advisors were not wrong about any of this. Justinian listened and sent the army anyway. He gave the command to Belisarius by 533. Belisarius was in his early 30s and already the most capable military commander in the Byzantine world by a margin significant enough that the second best candidate was not close. He had grown up in the Balkans, like Justinian, which may have meant something to the emperor, or may have been coincidence. He had distinguished himself early in campaigns against Persia, demonstrating a quality that is rarer in military commanders than courage or tactical intelligence. The ability to understand what an engagement was actually about before it began, and to shape the conditions of contact rather than simply responding to them. He understood mobile warfare in the way that very few commanders of his era understood it. The armies of the late Roman world had been evolving toward a style built around heavy cavalry, riders with armor and lances who could strike with force and then withdraw before a counter could be organized. Belisarius had spent years understanding what this style of warfare could do and what it could not do, and had developed approaches to both that gave his forces a flexibility that more conventionally organized armies did not possess. He was also, in the dimension that mattered most to Justinian, a man whose loyalty was genuine rather than transactional. He did not follow Justinian because Justinian was emperor, and following the emperor was the rational calculation. He followed him in the way that capable people sometimes follow someone they have identified as actually understanding what needs to be done. He was also, and this is the detail that the official accounts of the Italian campaign tend to move past quickly, a man who had figured out early that Justinian did not fully trust him, and who had decided that this was not sufficient reason to do his job any differently. That quality, the specific choice to continue doing excellent work inside a relationship that did not fully honor it, was the most important thing about Belisarius. And it was the thing that made what eventually happened to him the weight that it carries. Belisarius sailed from Constantinople in late June with approximately 15,000 soldiers, 2,000 of them his own household cavalry, whose training and discipline reflected years of his personal investment. The fleet was large. The sea crossing was long. The logistical complexity of moving an army of that size across open water to a hostile coast was the kind of problem that had defeated previous attempts at similar operations. They landed in North Africa without significant opposition. What followed, compressed into the space of a few months, was one of the more startling military achievements in the history of late antiquity. Belisarius did not advance on the Vandal capital of Carthage immediately. He moved carefully, establishing his supply lines, understanding the terrain, reading the political situation inside the Vandal kingdom with the attention of someone who knew that military victory and political victory were not the same thing, and that achieving the first without preparing for the second was how you turned a triumph into an occupation. The Vandal king, Gelimer, had internal problems that Belisarius assessed correctly. His kingdom was not as unified as its century of uncontested control had made it appear from the outside. He had recently deposed his own predecessor, creating a class of people with grievances against him, who were not natural allies of the Byzantine expedition, but who were also not committed to fighting for Gelimer specifically. The decisive engagement happened at a place called Ad Decimum, miles from Carthage. Belisarius's cavalry tactics produced the result his preparation had made likely. The Vandal force broke. Gelimer fled. Belisarius entered Carthage, not as a besieging force, but as a column marching through open gates. With the population watching in the specific way that populations watch when they are uncertain whether to be frightened and are deciding based on what they see in the next few minutes, he fed his soldiers from the Vandal royal stores. He maintained discipline with the deliberate firmness of a commander who understood that how his army behaved in the first days of occupation would determine how cooperative or resistant the local population was for the years that followed. He returned property to the churches that the Vandals had taken from the Nicene communities. He was not being kind. He was being precise. He had read the political situation and understood what behaviors would consolidate the victory and what behaviors would undermine it. A second engagement finished what the first had begun. Gelimer was captured. The Vandal kingdom, which had controlled North Africa for over a century, ceased to exist within months of the Byzantine expedition's arrival. When Belisarius returned to Constantinople and walked through the streets of the capital with the captured Vandal king and the treasures of a kingdom in his train, the city experienced something it had not experienced in a very long time. The feeling that Rome was actually winning, not managing, not surviving, not negotiating from a position of defensive necessity. Winning, expanding, taking back what had been lost. The crowd that watched Belisarius's triumph was watching something that most of them had not believed they would see in their lifetimes. The physical evidence that the empire they lived inside was capable of doing what Justinian had always claimed it was capable of. Justinian stood and watched the procession and felt something that the sources cannot give us direct access to, but that the decisions he made in the following months make legible. He felt that it was possible, that Rome could actually be made whole again, that the territories lost in the chaos of the 5th century were not permanently lost, that the map of the world as it was did not have to be the map of the world as it remained, that one man's will and one general's capability and one empire's resources, combined in the right way at the right moment, could actually reverse the direction that history had been traveling for 100 years. This feeling was the most dangerous thing that happened to Justinian in 534, more dangerous than any military threat, more dangerous than the theological disputes that continued to resist resolution, more dangerous than the financial pressure of building and campaigning simultaneously, because the feeling was not wrong. Exactly. North Africa had been taken. The map had changed. The direction of history had been nudged. The feeling was wrong about what North Africa meant. It was wrong to treat it as proof that the same approach would work everywhere, that Italy would fall the way North Africa had fallen. that the factors that had made Belisarius's campaign succeed would replicate in other theatres against other opponents under other conditions. But Justinian was not in the mood to examine the conditions of his success carefully. He was in the mood of a man who has proven the doubters wrong. He looked at Italy. The Ostrogothic kingdom that controlled the Italian peninsula had been, for several decades, a reasonably functional arrangement. Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king who had governed Italy from 493 until 526, had maintained the Roman administrative tradition with enough competence that many of the Italian population had not experienced the change of government as catastrophic. He had kept the Senate functioning. He had kept the law courts operating. He had built in Ravenna with a sophistication that borrowed from both Roman and Gothic traditions. Theodoric was dead. His successors were less capable and less secure. The kingdom had been weakened by internal conflict over succession. The relationship between the Ostrogothic rulers and their Roman subjects was more tense than it had been under Theodoric, and the Ostrogoths followed a form of Christianity that Rome's bishops considered heresy, which meant that the religious establishment in Italy had reasons to prefer a Chalcedonian emperor in Constantinople to a Gothic king in Ravenna. The conditions looked favourable. Justinian sent Belisarius to Italy in 535. He expected it to go like North Africa. It did not go like North Africa. The first movements were encouraging. Sicily fell quickly. The southern part of the Italian peninsula offered little resistance. Belisarius moved north with the efficiency that had characterized his African campaign and reached Naples. Naples resisted. The siege took longer than expected. When the city finally fell, there was violence that Belisarius had not been able to prevent entirely. The kind of violence that happens when soldiers who have been outside walls for weeks finally get through them. He continued north. Rome itself opened its gates in December of 536. The Ostrogothic garrison withdrew rather than defend, a city where the civilian population had already decided that Byzantine rule was preferable to continued Gothic occupation. Belisarius entered the city of Rome without a battle. He was inside the city that the whole enterprise was named for. He was also immediately in serious trouble. The Ostrogothic army had not collapsed the way the Vandal army had collapsed. It had regrouped under a new king named Vitiges. It marched back south and laid siege to Rome in March of 537. Belisarius was inside the city with a force that was significantly smaller than the besieging army. He sent urgent requests to Constantinople for reinforcements and supplies. He received some of what he asked for. Not enough. The siege lasted more than a year. What Belisarius did during that year, defending a city with inadequate forces against a larger army, is one of the more remarkable extended military performances of the 6th century. He used the city's walls and the city's geography and the specific advantages that defenders have against besiegers to keep the situation from becoming catastrophic, while simultaneously staging raids and counterattacks that kept the Ostrogothic army off balance. He also kept writing to Justinian. The letters were precise and honest in the way that Belisarius's communications tended to be. He described what he had, what he needed, and the gap between them. He explained that the forces available to him were insufficient for the campaign being asked of him. He requested specific reinforcements. He explained what would happen if those reinforcements did not arrive. Justinian sent some of what was requested. He also sent instructions that reflected the gap between the emperor in Constantinople looking at a map and the general in Rome looking at an actual military situation. He wanted more territory taken. He wanted the campaign accelerated. He wanted results that the available forces could not produce. And here, in the correspondence between Justinian and Belisarius during the Italian campaign, something becomes visible that the North African success had temporarily obscured. Justinian did not fully trust Belisarius, not because Belisarius had given him specific reason for distrust, but because Justinian was, at his core, a man who needed to understand and control the systems he was responsible for, and Belisarius was a system that he could not fully understand or control. The general's capability was beyond question. The general's loyalty had been demonstrated repeatedly, but the general was also, by the nature of what he did and how he did it, operating in a space where Justinian could not see everything that was happening and could not be certain that what he was being told was complete. Part of it was resource constraint. Part of it was the Persian frontier requiring continuous attention, and part of it, the part that the sources hint at without making fully explicit, was this: a general who wins battles with insufficient resources creates a reputation independent of the emperor who sent him. Justinian had not forgotten what had happened when the plague came. He had noted it. He never fully set it aside. Belisarius kept winning anyway, because he was Belisarius. The Ostrogoths were pushed north. Ravenna, the Gothic capital, fell in 540. Vitiges was captured. The campaign that Justinian had expected to resolve in a few years had taken 5, but it had resolved. Italy was back on the map of Rome. Justinian recalled Belisarius to Constantinople. It was the correct decision, in one sense. Belisarius had been in Italy for 5 years. The eastern frontier with Persia required attention. The general needed to be available for other situations as they developed. It was the wrong decision in another sense, which became apparent almost immediately. The Ostrogothic resistance had not ended. It had reorganized under a new leader named Totila, who proved to be both militarily capable and politically sophisticated in ways that Vitiges had not been. The Gothic forces began taking back what they had lost, city by city, province by province. The Italian population, which had initially accepted Byzantine rule as an improvement over Ostrogothic governance, was revising that assessment under the weight of Byzantine taxation and the specific disappointment of a liberation that had turned into an occupation without becoming notably better than what it replaced. Justinian sent Belisarius back to Italy. He sent him without adequate forces, without adequate supply, with the specific combination of authority and resource limitation that was becoming the characteristic pattern of how Justinian managed his most capable instrument. Belisarius continued doing his job. He always continued doing his job. That belief, the belief that North Africa had proven, was going to be the most expensive thing Justinian ever purchased. Chapter 7. The War That Ate Italy. There is a letter that Belisarius wrote to Justinian sometime around 546 that does not appear in most popular accounts of the Byzantine reconquest of Italy. It should. The letter describes the city of Rome, not Rome as a military objective or a symbolic prize or a point on a map that needed to be held against the Ostrogothic forces pressing from the north. The letter describes Rome as a place where people had been living, where the continuous thread of urban civilization had been running without interruption since before the empire was an empire, and what was happening to that thread under the weight of what the war was doing to it. Totila, the Ostrogothic king who had reversed most of what the first phase of the Byzantine campaign had achieved, had done something that no one had expected him to do. He had taken Rome and then, rather than defend it or destroy it, had proposed to empty it, to remove the remaining population and leave the city standing but uninhabited, a monument to a civilization, without the civilization inside it. He wanted to turn Rome into a field. Belisarius wrote to Justinian that this could not be allowed, not for military reasons, though there were military reasons, for reasons that were harder to put into a letter, but that he attempted to put into a letter anyway. He wrote that Rome was not simply a city, that its existence as an inhabited, functioning place was part of what the entire enterprise was supposed to be preserving, that a Rome without Romans was not the Rome that anyone had spent anything to recover, that taking back the geography while allowing the living thing inside the geography to be extinguished was a way of winning that was indistinguishable, in its actual consequences, from losing. He was asking for reinforcements sufficient to prevent this. Justinian sent what he sent, which was not sufficient. Totila emptied Rome, not completely. The city was not turned into a field. Belisarius moved fast enough, with what he had, to force Totila to abandon the plan before it was fully executed. The population that remained was small. The city that Belisarius reoccupied was a diminished thing, a place that was still Rome in name and geography and the accumulated physical evidence of centuries, but that had been hollowed out in ways that the maps Justinian was looking at in Constantinople could not show. This is where the Italian campaign stops being a story about military strategy and becomes a story about the difference between what a man believes he is doing and what he is actually doing. Justinian believed he was restoring Italy to Rome. He believed this sincerely and completely, and in a way that shaped every decision he made about the campaign from its beginning to its end. The word restoration was not a political abstraction for him. It described something real, something that had existed and been lost and could be recovered. The way a building that has been damaged can be repaired and returned to what it was. What he was actually doing was conducting a 20-year war across a peninsula that had been continuously inhabited since before Rome was Rome, through the fields and the cities and the aqueducts and the roads and the agricultural systems and the intricate web of local arrangements that made ordinary life possible. And the war was doing to all of those things what wars do to things that are in their path. The damage was not intentional. Neither Justinian nor Belisarius was pursuing a policy of deliberate destruction, but intention and consequence are not the same thing. And the consequence of 2 decades of military campaigning across the Italian peninsula was a country that emerged from the war with a population reduced by death and flight and famine, with cities that had been besieged and taken and retaken until their physical fabric was compromised in ways that would take generations to repair, with agricultural land that had been stripped and burned and left fallow through the years, when armies moved across it and soldiers needed to eat. The historian Procopius, who travelled with Belisarius and saw the Italian campaign from close enough to understand what it was doing to the places it passed through, wrote descriptions of what he saw in the Italian countryside that read less like military history and more like accounts of a slow catastrophe. Depopulated farms, abandoned villages, people who had survived the immediate violence of military contact, reduced to conditions of material deprivation that the fighting itself had not produced, but that the disruption of the systems that sustained ordinary life had. He was describing what restoration looked like from the ground. Justinian was not reading it from the ground. He was reading it from Constantinople, from maps and reports, and the filtered version of events that travelled through the administrative channels between a distant capital and a distant theatre of war. The gap between those 2 readings of the same events was not dishonesty on anyone's part. It was the structural limitation of governing at a distance. the unavoidable distortion that happens when the consequences of decisions are experienced in one place and the decisions are made in another. Time was the variable his model could not contain. Legal texts do not change while you repair them. Buildings remain what they are while you work on them. Political and human situations do not wait. The Italy he was trying to restore had continued becoming something else during the 20 years it took to restore it. And what he recovered, by the time the campaign ended, was not the Italy he had set out to recover when it began. He did not understand this completely. If he had understood it completely, it might have broken something in him that he needed intact to keep going. He kept going. The most consequential gap was the one between what Belisarius asked for and what he received. The pattern of the Italian campaign, repeated across its 20-year arc with the consistency of something structural rather than accidental, was this: Belisarius would identify what was needed to achieve a military objective. He would request it. He would receive a portion of it. He would achieve what was achievable with the portion he received, which was sometimes considerable and sometimes not. He would then encounter the limits of what was achievable with inadequate resources. He would write to Constantinople, explaining those limits and requesting more. The cycle would repeat. The underfunding was not simple negligence. The treasury was under genuine pressure. The Persian frontier required resources. And then there was the part that the sources hint at without making fully explicit. A general who wins battles with insufficient resources and still produces results creates a reputation that becomes independent of the emperor who sent him. The soldiers who served under Belisarius were loyal to Belisarius in ways that overlapped with but were not identical to their loyalty to Justinian. The populations he governed well-formed views of him that were independent of their views of the distant emperor he represented. Justinian had not forgotten what had happened when the plague came, and his survival was uncertain, and the most capable general in the empire had been among the people making calculations about what came next. He had noted it. He never fully set it aside. The underfunding of the Italian campaign and the pattern of recalling Belisarius at moments that were strategically inconvenient may have had entirely rational justifications at each individual decision point. The cumulative pattern looks like something else. It looks like a man managing a dependency by ensuring that the person he depended on never accumulated quite enough success to be independent of the dependence. Belisarius operated within this constraint for 20 years, with a patience and a professionalism that is, in retrospect, one of the more remarkable things about him. He continued to function. He continued to win what was winnable with what he had. He continued to write honest letters to Constantinople, describing the situation clearly and accepting with apparent equanimity the partial responses he received. He simply kept doing his job, and Italy kept not being restored. Narses, an elderly commander who had served Justinian for decades in various capacities, eventually finished what Belisarius had started, not through superior generalship, but through superior resources that Justinian, for reasons that remain somewhat opaque, was willing to give Narses in quantities he had consistently denied Belisarius. The Ostrogoths were finally defeated in 554. Italy was Roman again. The Italy that was Roman again was not the Italy that Belisarius had entered in 535. 2 decades of warfare had moved across its population and its cities and its agricultural economy, with the specific destructiveness of prolonged conflict in a landscape that cannot sustain it. The population had declined. The cities that had been centers of Roman civilization for centuries had been damaged repeatedly as they changed hands and changed back. Rome itself had been besieged and taken and lost and taken again multiple times. And each time that cycle completed itself, something that had been continuous since before the empire was lost. Justinian had spent 20 years and resources that the empire felt in every province to take back a peninsula that he had believed would fall in a campaign measured in months. He had taken it. He would die before seeing it fall again. 3 years after his death, the Lombards invaded from the north and took most of Italy within a few years. The Roman Italy that had cost 20 years of lives and treasure survived as a Roman possession for less time than the campaign to take it had lasted. But in 533, standing in Constantinople, watching Belisarius's triumph from the North African campaign, none of that was visible yet. What was visible was the procession, the captured king, the recovered treasures, the crowd that was feeling, perhaps for the first time in a century, that Rome was actually winning. Justinian watched it and believed the feeling. That belief was going to be the most expensive thing he ever purchased. Chapter 8. The Plague and the Silence of God. In the spring of 541, a ship arrived in the Egyptian port of Pelusium, carrying grain from the interior of Africa. It was carrying something else. The sources that describe what happened next were written by people who did not have the conceptual framework to understand what they were observing. They knew people were dying. They knew the dying was happening at a scale that exceeded anything in living memory. They knew it was spreading, moving from port to port along the trade routes that connected the empire's cities, arriving in new places with a speed and an indifference to human arrangement that felt, to the people experiencing it, like something that could not have a natural explanation. Procopius was in Constantinople when the plague reached the capital in 542. He wrote a description of it that is still read today, not because it is medically precise, which it is not, but because it is written by someone who was present and was trying to record what presence felt like when the thing you were present for was this. He described the symptoms, the swellings in the groin and the armpit, the fever, the progression that in some cases was swift and in others extended across days during which the outcome was uncertain in ways that made the uncertainty its own particular form of suffering. He described the scale. Constantinople at the height of the outbreak was losing, by his account, thousands of people each day. The systems that existed to manage the dead, the burial practices and the clergy and the administrative apparatus of death, could not keep pace with what was dying. Bodies accumulated in places that bodies were not supposed to accumulate. The smell of the city changed. He described what happened to the city as a functioning place. The markets slowed. The courts stopped. The offices of the imperial administration that had been running continuously through wars and riots, and the ordinary turbulence of imperial governance, found themselves without enough people to operate. Grain sat in warehouses because there were not enough people healthy enough to move it. Ships sat in harbors for the same reason. The machinery of a city of 500,000 people required a minimum number of those people to be functioning on any given day, and the plague had reduced the number below the minimum. And then Justinian himself became ill. The news spread through the empire before anyone could control it, which meant it spread in the way that important news always spreads when the official channels cannot keep pace with it, quickly and in multiple distorted versions simultaneously. The emperor was ill. The emperor was dying. The emperor was dead. In various corners of the empire, people who heard various versions of this news began making the calculations that people make when the current arrangement may be about to change. Belisarius was in Italy. Various military commanders and senior officials were in various locations across the empire. The conversations that took place among these people during the weeks when Justinian's survival was uncertain were not the kind of conversations that were written down and preserved. They happened in private, in careful language, with the specific deniability of people who were not actually doing anything wrong, but who were also not going to pretend that the question of succession was not a question. Justinian survived. He recovered with a completeness that surprised the physicians who had attended him and may have surprised himself. He returned to governance. He resumed the correspondence, the decrees, the theological arguments, the continuous activity that had characterized his reign since its beginning. He also knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent his life learning to read the gap between how systems presented themselves and how they actually functioned, exactly what had happened in the conversations he had not been present for. He did not act on this knowledge immediately. He filed it in the place where he kept the things that were important enough to keep, but not yet ripe enough to use. And he returned to the work that the plague had interrupted. The plague had not waited for him to recover before continuing its work. By the time Justinian was back at his desk, the epidemic had spread west from Constantinople through Greece and into Italy, arriving in the theatre of the campaign against the Ostrogoths at a moment when Belisarius was already operating with insufficient forces and inadequate supply. The military population, which was the concentrated, mobile, physically stressed population most vulnerable to rapid transmission of disease, suffered accordingly. Units that had been undermanned before the plague arrived were reduced further. Strategic plans that had been designed around specific force levels became inoperable without the forces. The Italian campaign, which had already been longer and more expensive and more destructive than anyone had planned, became longer and more expensive and more destructive for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy or generalship or the relative capabilities of the opposing forces. The plague simply arrived and took what it took. This is the aspect of the plague that the sources struggled most to account for. Wars happened because of choices that people made. Theological disputes happened because of positions that people took. Administrative failures happened because of decisions that people implemented badly or corruptly. The entire apparatus of Justinian's worldview was built around the premise that the world could be understood as a set of problems that had solutions, that, with sufficient intelligence and will, and the correct formulation, you could identify what was wrong and fix it. Then disease arrived. Without argument, without doctrine, without an enemy Justinian could name. It did not have a position. It did not make choices. It was not the consequence of any decision that anyone had made or failed to make. It arrived because grain ships traveled from the interior of Africa to the Egyptian coast, and whatever was in the shipment had come along for the passage. The causality was mechanical and impersonal in a way that the 6th century had no conceptual vocabulary to process. Justinian's response, as recorded in the decrees he issued during and after the plague, was to continue governing. He adjusted laws to deal with the specific legal problems the plague created. People were dying without wills. Estates were accumulating without heirs. The ordinary legal machinery of inheritance and property and obligation was generating situations that the existing law had not been written to handle. He wrote new law to handle them. This was exactly the response you would predict from a man whose fundamental belief was that the world could be organized by sufficiently precise law. A problem had appeared. The problem had a legal dimension. He addressed the legal dimension. What he did not do, in the documents that survive, was engage directly with what the plague meant in the larger framework of what he believed he was doing. His entire reign was built on a theological premise. He was the instrument of God's will. The empire he governed was the Christian empire, the empire that God had entrusted to his stewardship so that it could fulfill its divine function of extending Christian civilization and Christian law across the world. The buildings he built, and the laws he wrote, and the territories he recovered were all, in his understanding, aspects of a single sacred project, and then the plague arrived and killed without reference to faith or virtue or imperial service. It killed clergy and soldiers and farmers and administrators and the people who worked in the imperial palace and the people who lived in the streets of Constantinople with equal indifference to their role in the sacred project. If the empire was God's instrument, what did the plague mean? Justinian did not answer this question in writing, not directly, not in the way that a man wrestling openly with a crisis of faith would answer it. He continued to issue decrees and conduct arguments and manage the eastern frontier and correspond with Belisarius about Italy. He continued to pray, because he had always prayed, and the plague did not change that. He continued to behave as though the project he was engaged in was divinely sanctioned and would ultimately succeed. The silence in his documents about what the plague meant theologically is one of the more revealing absences in the historical record of his reign. He wrote about everything. He wrote about the nature of Christ with a precision and a persistence that exhausted the theologians he debated. He wrote about the principles of just law with a comprehensiveness that took years and 10 expert scholars to organize. He wrote about military strategy and administrative reform and architectural specification and the proper conduct of religious ceremony. He did not write, in any document that survives, a direct engagement with the question of what it meant that God had sent this particular thing into the middle of this particular project. The silence is not evidence of doubt. Exactly. It may be evidence of something more interesting than doubt. It may be evidence of a man who had decided, consciously or not, that the question was one he could not answer, and that answering it was therefore not useful, and that the only response available to him that was consistent with who he was and what he was trying to do was to continue doing it. The plague was the one thing Justinian could not codify. Rebuild, command, or argue into order. He did not stop. The plague continued for years, returning in waves that the sources describe with the weary specificity of people who had learned that the cessation of dying did not mean the dying was finished. Constantinople was hit multiple times. The provinces were hit. The military forces that Justinian needed for Italy and for the eastern frontier were hit repeatedly, never recovering fully between outbreaks before the next one arrived. The financial consequences compounded the human ones. A population reduced by death and by the economic disruption that death produced could not pay taxes at the rates the imperial system required. The revenue that funded the campaigns and the buildings and the administrative apparatus of the empire contracted at a moment when the demands on that revenue were not contracting. The pressure on the ordinary people of the empire, on the farmers and the merchants and the artisans and the laborers whose capacity to generate the wealth that funded everything else was being reduced by disease and by the administrative burden of an empire at war on multiple fronts, simultaneously, was real in ways that did not appear in imperial decrees, but that appeared in the countryside and the smaller cities and the places where the machinery of governance met the actual human beings it was supposed to serve. Justinian responded in the ways available to him. He issued debt relief in certain categories. He extended deadlines for tax payment in provinces that had been particularly affected. He wrote law that addressed specific legal problems the plague created. He continued to campaign in Italy. He continued to build. He continued to argue theology. He continued because stopping was not something he knew how to do. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the years when the plague was at its worst and the Italian campaign was at its most expensive and the theological disputes were at their most intractable. Theodora was ill, not with the plague, with something else. Something that the sources identify with enough symptom description to suggest what we would now call cancer. Something that did not respond to what the physicians could do, and that was progressing in the way that such things progress, taking from her gradually, and then less gradually, the physical capacity to do what she had always done. She had been the one who understood what the systems he built were doing to the people inside them. She had been the one who could walk into a room and know within the first few minutes which of the people in it were telling the truth and which were performing it. She had been the one who provided, without ever formally claiming to provide it, the connection between the emperor's intelligence and the human reality of the empire his intelligence was trying to govern. She was getting smaller. He was still working. The plague that he could not fix, the war that was taking longer and costing more than he had calculated, the theological unity that continued to resist every formulation he produced, and now this, which was the most personal form of the lesson that the plague had been teaching him at scale. There were things that will and intelligence and the correct formulation could not fix. He had learned this intellectually from the plague. He was about to learn it in the way that people learn things that they will not forget. He was about to learn it from the chair beside her bed. Chapter 9. God, Doctrine, and the War That Could Not Be Won. There is a story that Justinian told himself about what he was doing. It was not a simple story. It was not the story of a conqueror who wanted more territory, or an administrator who wanted more efficient systems, or a builder who wanted monuments to his own name. Those were all present in what he was doing, but they were not the story he told himself. The story he told himself was this: God had entrusted the Roman Empire to him for a purpose. That purpose was not merely political. It was not merely legal or architectural or military. The purpose was the unification of the Christian world under a single faith, a single emperor, and a single understanding of what Christianity actually was and what it required of the people who professed it. The empire and the church were not two separate institutions that happened to coexist in the same geography. They were two aspects of a single divine project, and the emperor who governed the empire was also, in his own understanding, responsible for the health and unity of the church. This is why he argued theology, not as a hobby, not as the intellectual indulgence of a man who happened to find doctrinal questions interesting, as a duty, as the specific duty of a man who believed that the fracture running through the Christian world was a fracture running through the body of the empire he was responsible for, and that healing one required healing the other, and that healing either required finding the correct theological formulation that both sides of the dispute could accept. He had been working on this problem since before he was emperor. The dispute had been running since 451. When the Council of Chalcedon had declared the official position of the Church on the nature of Christ, Christ had two natures, human and divine, united in one person, without confusion or separation. This was the Chalcedonian formula. It was the position of the Church in Constantinople. It was the position of the Church in Rome. It was, in the understanding of the imperial establishment, the correct answer to a question that had been argued for a century and was now settled. The problem was that a very large portion of the Eastern Church did not agree. The communities in Egypt and Syria and large parts of Palestine held to a different understanding, that Christ had one united nature in which the human and divine were inseparably joined. This was the Miaphysite position. Constantinople called it heresy. The communities that held it called it truth. And they held it with the specific intensity of people who believe they are being asked to deny something they know to be true in exchange for political accommodation, with a power that does not have the authority to demand the exchange. This was not a small disagreement between theologians who would otherwise get along. It mapped onto geography and ethnicity and language in ways that made it a political fracture as much as a theological one. Egypt was the wealthiest province of the empire. It fed Constantinople. Its church was Miaphysite. Syria was strategically critical on the eastern frontier. Its church was largely Miaphysite. Demanding Chalcedonian conformity from these communities meant demanding it from populations whose cooperation was not optional and whose theological identity was not negotiable. Previous emperors had tried various approaches, and all of them had failed in characteristic ways. Pure enforcement drove the Miaphysite communities into resistance that was more damaging than the theological disagreement it was trying to eliminate. Compromise formulas that tried to satisfy both positions satisfied neither, and produced the specific anger that people feel when they believe someone is trying to trick them into surrendering something important while pretending to respect it. Toleration without resolution maintained the fracture without addressing it, which meant the political instability the fracture produced continued without any movement toward ending it. Justinian believed he could do what his predecessors had not done. He believed this because he believed the problem was a problem of formulation. That somewhere in the vast landscape of Greek theological language there was a way of saying what Christianity believed about the nature of Christ that was both orthodox in the Chalcedonian sense and acceptable to the Miaphysite communities. That the dispute persisted not because the two sides wanted incompatible things, but because no one had yet found the precise language that revealed their underlying agreement. This belief was characteristic of how Justinian approached every problem he faced. The law was broken because no one had organized it correctly. Hagia Sophia required mathematics because the architecture of previous churches had not understood the relationship between structure and light correctly. Italy needed to be recovered because the political arrangements that had allowed it to drift out of Roman control were not permanent facts of the world, but mistakes that could be corrected. The theological dispute needed a better formula. He spent decades looking for one. The search produced a series of theological documents, councils, decrees, and interventions that are among the more complicated episodes in the history of 6th century Christianity, and that are remembered to the extent that they are remembered at all outside specialist scholarship, primarily for how comprehensively they failed to achieve what they were trying to achieve. The Theopashite formula, which affirmed that one of the Trinity had suffered in the flesh, was an attempt to address a key Miaphysite concern while remaining technically within Chalcedonian bounds. It generated controversy in Rome, which viewed any modification of the Chalcedonian formula with the suspicion of an institution that had invested its authority in the council's conclusions and did not welcome suggestions that those conclusions needed refinement. The 3 chapters controversy was larger and more damaging. Justinian decided that condemning 3 specific theological writers who had been influential in the Chalcedonian tradition would demonstrate to the Miaphysite communities that the empire was not committed to those writers' most extreme positions. This required getting the church's agreement that the 3 writers, who had been dead for over a century, should be retroactively condemned. The Miaphysite communities were not impressed. Condemning dead Chalcedonians did not make Chalcedon acceptable. The Western Church was furious. The Pope at the time, Vigilius, had been elevated to his position partly through Theodora's influence, and had made commitments about his theological flexibility that he found increasingly difficult to honor once he was actually sitting in Rome and managing an institution that was deeply committed to Chalcedonian orthodoxy. He resisted the 3 chapters' condemnation. Justinian summoned him to Constantinople. He came and then escaped to a church and claimed sanctuary. A pope seeking sanctuary from the emperor, in the emperor's own capital, which was the kind of situation that revealed how far things had departed from the orderly theological governance Justinian had imagined. Justinian eventually got what he wanted in formal terms. The Second Council of Constantinople in 553 condemned the 3 chapters with sufficient official authority to constitute an ecumenical decision. The Western churches that refused to accept the condemnation were in schism from Constantinople for decades afterward. The Miaphysite communities were still not reconciled. He had managed to anger the West and failed to satisfy the East simultaneously, which was, in a precise political sense, the worst possible outcome. He had invested enormous energy and political capital and had produced a result that made the theological landscape of the empire more complicated and more fractured than it had been when he began. This was not stupidity. Justinian was not stupid. What it was the specific failure that comes from applying the wrong tool to a problem that the tool cannot fix. He understood law well enough to know that you could find the formulation that resolved a legal contradiction if you understood the underlying principle clearly enough. He had proven this. The corpus juris civilis existed because the principle was recoverable from the contradictions, and the right formulation could express it. He understood architecture well enough to know that you could solve structural problems that appeared insoluble if you understood the mathematics of force and distribution correctly. He had proven this. Hagia Sophia existed because the mathematics were there to be discovered and applied. He applied the same approach to theology. You can force a signature. You cannot force a faith. His model of how the world worked assumed that the correct arrangement of authority and law and formulation could produce the correct behavior in the people subject to them. But the interior of what a person believed about God was outside the reach of the formulation. The decree, the council decision, and the deposed bishop, the Miaphysite communities of Egypt and Syria were not holding their theological position because they had independently arrived at a conclusion about the nature of Christ and were stubbornly refusing to be corrected. They were holding their position because it was their position, because it was how they understood themselves and their relationship to God and to the Christian tradition they had inherited, because it was what their bishops taught and their liturgies expressed and their communities organized their spiritual lives around. Asking them to accept Chalcedon was not asking them to correct an error in their thinking. It was asking them to become different people than they were. You cannot find a formulation that resolves that kind of dispute, because the dispute is not about the formulation. Justinian never fully understood this, or he understood it at moments and then retreated from the understanding, because accepting it completely would have required him to accept that there were things the emperor could not fix by finding the right language and applying sufficient pressure. The emperor could not fix this. He could sign documents. He could convene councils. He could depose bishops who refused to cooperate and install bishops who would sign what he needed signed. He did all of these things. Bishops were deposed and installed across the theological landscape of the empire, with a frequency that made the episcopate feel more like an administrative appointment than a spiritual office. The communities these bishops served continued to believe what they believed. And then there was Theodora. She was Miaphysite, not diplomatically Miaphysite, not Miaphysite as a political positioning relative to the communities that held the position, but genuinely, personally, theologically Miaphysite in the way that people are the thing they are when they are not performing it for an audience. She had encountered the Miaphysite tradition in Alexandria during the years before she met Justinian, and whatever had happened in that encounter had produced a commitment that 20 years of living beside a Chalcedonian emperor did not modify. They disagreed about this. Fundamentally, not the way that people who are performing a disagreement disagree, not strategically, not as a coordinated approach to managing both sides of the theological dispute, but actually, he believed the Chalcedonian formula was correct. She believed the Miaphysite position was correct. They had both thought about this with the full force of the considerable intelligence each of them possessed, and they had arrived at different conclusions, and yet they governed together. For 20 years they managed the theological dispute from positions that were genuinely opposed, each protecting aspects of the communities they identified with, each constraining the other's ability to simply impose their position. And the empire somehow continued to function in the space between their disagreement. The Miaphysite clergy who sheltered in the palace during Justinian's reign were there because Theodora protected them. The Chalcedonian enforcement that periodically tightened across the eastern provinces reflected Justinian's position. Neither of them could fully implement what they actually believed should happen because the other one was there. This may have been better for the empire than either of their positions fully implemented would have been. Justinian probably did not experience it as better. He experienced it as a constraint on doing what he believed needed to be done. He was right that it was a constraint. He may not have seen clearly enough what it was constraining him from doing, and what the consequences of doing it without constraint might have been. She died in 548. The constraint was gone, and Justinian, who had spent 20 years trying to find the theological formulation that would resolve the dispute, spent the remaining 17 years of his reign with fewer limits on what he could try. He tried more things. He convened the Second Council of Constantinople in 553. He issued more decrees. He deposed more bishops. He signed more documents. He argued more theology, with more clergy, across more years, with greater intensity and greater isolation as the people around him grew exhausted by the arguing, and he did not. The theological dispute was not resolved when he died. It was not resolved in the century after he died. The Miaphysite communities of Egypt and Syria that he had spent his reign trying to bring back into unity with Constantinople were still separate when the Arab armies arrived in the 7th century. The populations of those provinces, who had been living under Byzantine pressure to abandon a theological position they had held for generations, found that the new rulers did not require them to be Chalcedonian. The ease with which Byzantine control of Egypt and Syria collapsed in the face of the Arab conquests had causes that went beyond theology. But theology was one of them. The fracture that Justinian spent his reign trying to heal with formulas helped open the door that ended Byzantine control of its wealthiest provinces within a century of his death. He had wanted to make Rome whole. He had tried to make the faith whole as the necessary condition of making Rome whole. The effort to make the faith whole, conducted with the only method he knew, the method of finding the correct arrangement and applying sufficient authority, had contributed to the conditions that made whole impossible in a way that outlasted everything else he built. The building in Constantinople was still standing. The argument about what happened inside it was still running. It would not stop running for a very long time. He never stopped trying to stop it. Chapter 10. Theodora. This chapter is not about Theodora's life. That story exists. It begins in the Hippodrome and ends in this same palace, in this same city, and it is a story worth knowing on its own terms. This chapter is about something smaller and more specific. It is about what Justinian could not do without her, and what happened to the things he was trying to do when she was gone. He met her sometime in the early 500s and 20s. The exact circumstances are not recorded with the precision that would satisfy a historian who wanted to know exactly when and where and what was said. What is recorded is the fact of the meeting and what followed from it, which is sufficient for the purposes of this chapter. He was the most analytically capable person in the Byzantine world. He had read more law than any practicing judge. He had argued theology with every significant theologian of his era and held his own with all of them. He had designed, in the conceptual sense, the administrative reforms that were remaking the empire. He had identified, with the precision of a diagnostician, every major structural failure in the civilization he was about to inherit. He could not walk into a room and know, within the first few minutes, which of the people in it were telling the truth. This is not a small limitation in a Byzantine court. It is close to a fatal one. The Byzantine court was an environment organized entirely around performance. Everyone in it was performing something. Performing loyalty, performing neutrality, performing theological agreement, performing administrative competence, performing the specific emotional register that the emperor of the moment seemed to require from the people around him. The performance was not dishonesty in the simple sense. It was survival. In an environment where the wrong display of feeling or opinion in the wrong moment could end a career or worse, you learned to manage what you showed. You learned to manage it so thoroughly, over so many years, that the performance and the performer eventually became difficult to separate even from the inside. Justinian knew this. He had been studying it since before he was emperor. He understood it intellectually with the same completeness that he understood legal contradiction and structural engineering. Understanding it intellectually was not the same as being able to read it in real time. In a room, in the face of a specific person who was saying something specific and meaning something else. Theodora could read it in real time. She had been doing it since childhood. The hippodrome world, the performance world, the world of people who had no formal standing and therefore survived entirely by reading the gap between what people presented and what they intended, had given her an accuracy about human behavior that no amount of analytical intelligence could replicate. She had spent years in rooms where the wrong reading of a person's actual intention could have immediate and serious consequences, and she had developed a precision in that reading that was as close to a skill as something so intuitive can be called. She could look at a court official presenting a report and know whether the report was complete or whether something had been left out of it, and what the leaving out meant. She could sit through an audience with a foreign ambassador and understand what the ambassador had not said as clearly as what he had said. She could assess, in the specific Byzantine way that required understanding, not just current positions, but the positions people were likely to move to under pressure, where a person's loyalty actually lived, as opposed to where it was officially declared to be. Justinian came to rely on this. Not in a formal censor, not in the sense of a defined role or an official advisory function, in the practical sense of a man who had discovered that the person beside him could see things he could not see and who had learned, over years, to factor those things into what he decided. She did not always agree with him. This is the part of their relationship that the official accounts tend to smooth over, because the official accounts needed them to be a harmonious pair working toward shared goals. The actual relationship was more interesting and more useful than that. They disagreed about theology. Fundamentally, and without resolution, she was Miaphysite, he was Chalcedonian. 20 years of proximity did not change either position. They disagreed about people. She had a view of John the Cappadocian that was more negative than Justinian's view, and her view turned out to be more accurate. And the method she used to remove John from his position, when Justinian finally permitted, it was one that Justinian would not have chosen, but also did not prevent. They disagreed about the pace and the method of things that Justinian wanted to do quickly and thoroughly, and that Theodora understood required more attention to the human resistance they would generate than his plans typically included. She was not his conscience, in the simple sense that term implies. She was not a moderating influence who softened his harshest instincts and produced a gentler version of his policies. She was a different kind of intelligence, operating alongside his intelligence. And the combination produced something that neither of them would have produced alone. He understood how to design systems. She understood how the people inside systems actually behaved. He understood the principle that should govern an arrangement. She understood whether the people who would implement the arrangement were capable of implementing it or were likely to implement something else while using the arrangement as cover. He understood what the law said. She understood whether the judge was going to apply what the law said, or whether the judge was going to apply what the person who had reached him first with the right amount of money had said. The empire they governed together was governed by both of these understandings simultaneously, not because they sat down and divided responsibilities formally, because the reality of what they each brought to the governance forced itself into the decisions in ways that neither of them designed, but both of them eventually came to depend on. Consider what she protected. The Miaphysite clergy, who sheltered in the palace during her years as Augusta, were there because she made it possible for them to be there. Not secretly, not in defiance of Justinian. In the specific way that a person with genuine authority within an institution can protect something the institution officially disapproves of, by making the protection so normalized that opposing it becomes more difficult than tolerating it. The clergy were there. They prayed. They maintained their community. They survived the decades of Justinian's theological pressure in ways that they would not have survived without her. This mattered to the people inside those communities in ways that no imperial decree could have produced. It meant that the empire, which officially regarded their theological position as heretical, contained within itself a space where they were protected. That the fracture Justinian was trying to close by force had a woman at the center of imperial power who believed, genuinely and personally, that the force was being applied to the wrong side of the fracture. She did not resolve the theological dispute. She could not. But she prevented its resolution by enforcement from being as complete as it would have been without her. And that incompleteness, that space she held open by her presence and her position, may have been what kept the eastern communities within the empire's orbit, rather than actively welcoming its enemies through the difficult decades of the Italian War and the plague and the continuous fiscal pressure of an empire, stretched beyond what its resources could comfortably sustain. Consider what she saw that he did not see. When ordinary people came to her with petitions that had no realistic path through the official administrative channels, she created unofficial paths, not by circumventing the law, by using the informal authority that proximity to the emperor gave her to ensure that certain things reached certain desks that they would not otherwise have reached. The merchant, whose property dispute had been decided by a judge who had been reached first by the other party. The widow whose inheritance had been administered by an official who had administered it primarily into his own accounts. The small community whose bishop had been deposed on theological grounds that happened to coincide with the bishop's inconvenient knowledge of a powerful person's finances. These were not the cases that appeared in the Corpus Juris Civilis. They were the cases that appeared in the gap between what the law said and what the law actually produced when implemented by human beings with human motivations. She saw the gap. She had grown up in the gap. She understood it with a directness and a specificity that Justinian, who had observed it from close range but never inhabited it, could not fully replicate. His law described what justice should look like. Her interventions addressed what justice was being prevented from looking like in specific cases involving specific people in specific circumstances. The combination of the two was something that neither of them alone would have been. She became ill sometime in the middle 500s and 40s. The illness was the kind that the physicians of the 6th century could identify but could not address with anything that changed the outcome. She was a woman in her middle 40s. She had been Augusta for 20 years. She had been present for Nika and for the construction of Hagia Sophia and for the North African campaign and for the beginning of the Italian campaign and for the plague and for 20 years of theological argument that had not resolved the theological dispute, but had at least kept it from being resolved in the worst possible way. She had been present for all of it. She became smaller, not in the way that people become smaller when power leaves them. Power did not leave Theodora until she died. She became smaller in the physical sense, the way that people become smaller when the body begins, the process that ends with the body stopping. She continued to receive petitions. She continued to intervene in the cases that came to her. She continued to hold the space open for the Miaphysite clergy in the palace. She continued to be present in the governance of the empire, in the ways she had always been present. She was dying, and the dying was visible, and there was nothing that the most powerful man in the world could do about it. Justinian sat beside her. The sources give us this image, without much detail. The emperor beside the bed. The physicians. The clergy who came to pray. The court that continued to function around the fact of what was happening in this room, continued to function in the careful, self-preserving way of institutions that understand that the person at the center is mortal, even when they do not say so directly. He had spent his entire reign believing that the world could be repaired, that the broken things could be fixed, that the right formulation, the correct arrangement, the sufficient application of intelligence and will and imperial authority could address whatever was wrong and make it right. He had fixed the law. He had built the building. He had recovered the territories. He had argued the theology with more precision and more persistence than any emperor before him. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he had proven, repeatedly, in ways that no one had expected, that power and intelligence, and will applied correctly, could accomplish things that the world had decided were impossible. He could not fix this. This was not a formulation problem. There was no correct arrangement of words, or authority, or resources that changed what was happening in this room. This was the thing that the plague had demonstrated at scale, and that he had processed at scale, which was different from processing it here. In this room, beside this specific person, who was not an abstraction of human suffering but the one person he had decided, long ago, was irreplaceable. She died in June of 548. She was somewhere around 48 years old. She had been empress for 21 years. What Justinian did in the immediate aftermath is not recorded with the kind of detail that would tell us what he felt. He continued to govern. This is what the record shows. He issued decrees. He managed the eastern frontier. He continued the Italian campaign. He continued the theological arguments. He also, in the decrees and documents he issued in the years after her death, continued to mention her name. Not always, not in every document, but with a frequency that scholars who have studied the pattern have noted as unusual, as if the official record of the empire needed to contain her presence even after her presence was gone, as if acknowledging her death in every document that might once have included her would make the absence more complete than he was prepared for it to be. He ran the empire for 17 more years after she died. In those 17 years, the decisions he made showed gradually, and then more visibly, what her presence had been doing that he had not fully understood while she was alive. The people who came to him with incomplete information, counting on the gap between the information presented and the information withheld to produce the decision they wanted, found a more receptive environment than they had found before. The court officials, whose performance of loyalty had always been more convincing to Justinian than to Theodora, found the performance easier to sustain. The theological pressure on the Eastern communities intensified in ways that she had spent 20 years preventing from becoming as intense as Justinian's position would have made it. He was still Justinian. The intelligence was still there. The will was still there. The fundamental belief that the world could be made orderly if you found the right formulation was still there. What was not there was the person who had been able to tell him when the formulation was not the problem. He kept her name in the documents. He could not keep what her name had meant inside the governance where it mattered. The empire noticed. Slowly. He probably noticed too. He kept working. What else was there to do? Chapter 11. The long unraveling. Power does not announce when it has begun to hollow out. It looks the same from the outside. The decrees still arrive with the emperor's seal. The officials still prostrate themselves in the audience hall. The armies still move on the maps that cover the tables where strategy is discussed. The theological arguments still fill the documents that travel between Constantinople and the provincial churches. The machinery of the empire continues to produce the outputs that the machinery of the empire is supposed to produce. What changes is something interior, something in the relationship between the intelligence directing the machinery and the machinery being directed, something in the quality of the attention that is being paid, something that does not appear in any single decision or any single document, but that accumulates across months and years, into a drift that the individual components of the system cannot correct, because they cannot see the whole clearly enough to know what correction would look like. Justinian, after Theodora, was still Justinian. This needs to be said plainly because the temptation, when describing the 17 years after her death, is to describe a decline that is cleaner and more dramatic than what the evidence actually shows. He did not become a different person. He did not stop working. He did not abandon the projects and the arguments and the continuous legislative activity that had characterized his reign since its beginning. He continued all of it, but the thing that Theodora had provided, the specific accuracy about the human material the empire was made of, was gone. And 17 years is a long time to govern the most complex institution in the world without the person who could tell you when your reading of the room was incomplete. The court expanded into the space that her absence had created. Gradually, without drama, without any single visible failure. The officials who had been careful about the accuracy of their reports when Theodora was alive found that the consequences of inaccuracy had changed. Not that inaccuracy was now rewarded, that it was less reliably detected. The gap between the official version of things and the actual state of things, which Theodora had spent 20 years helping Justinian navigate, widened in ways that were difficult to name, precisely because the thing that had been measuring the gap was no longer there to measure it. In the East, the Persian frontier required continuous management. The peace that had held through the earlier decades of the reign had been maintained through a combination of military deterrence and regular payment. The negotiations required to maintain the peace required an understanding of what the Persians actually wanted versus what they were saying they wanted, and what they would actually accept versus what they said they would accept. This kind of reading had benefited, without anyone formally acknowledging it, from Theodora's ability to assess the people conducting that management and tell Justinian when their accounts of the situation were being shaped by their own interests rather than by the situation itself. The Italian situation continued to be the Italian situation. The pragmatic sanction of 554 had formally restored Roman governance to Italy. On paper, the restoration was complete. In the actual peninsula, the restoration was a legal and administrative reality, sitting on top of a human and economic landscape that 20 years of warfare had reshaped in ways that Roman governance was not well positioned to address. The tax demands that the restored Roman administration brought with it were experienced by an Italian population that had already been through more than a generation of conflict, as an additional burden imposed by a distant authority that had spent 20 years fighting over them and now expected them to fund the administration that fighting had produced. Justinian continued to issue decrees about Italy. He continued to believe, or to behave as though he believed, that the correct administrative arrangements would produce the stable and prosperous Roman Italy that the campaigns had been intended to recover. He did not appear to have a clear picture of what was actually happening in the peninsula, of how deep the exhaustion was, of how thin the human capacity to sustain what Roman governance required had been stretched by everything the last 20 years had done to it. The Lombards were preparing in the north. The intelligence about what was happening north of the Alps was incomplete, and what was complete was not always reaching the emperor in forms that conveyed its full significance. The Lombards were a Germanic people who had been moving southward for years, positioning themselves in ways that, in retrospect, made their eventual invasion of Italy look like the logical conclusion of a process that had been running for a long time. Belisarius died in March of 565. Justinian outlived him by 8 months. He was not finished. He was not sure he would ever be finished. Still the East to manage. Still the theological disputes that continued to resist every formulation he constructed. Still the Italian administration that was producing outcomes that did not match the outcomes the decrees had been written to produce. Still, always, the work? That was the point. The dream had not died. By then, it was no longer clear whether Justinian was carrying the dream, or whether the dream was carrying him. Chapter 12. The Man Who Could Not Let Go. Go back to the room. Constantinople, November, 565. The old man is still at his desk. The candles have been burning for hours. The palace around him is quiet in the specific way that large buildings are quiet at 3 in the morning. Not silent. The stone settles. The wind finds the gaps in the windows. The distant sound of the city moving through its nighttime business reaches even here, but quiet enough that the only foreground sound is the scratch of the pen moving across the document on the desk and occasionally stopping. He is 83 years old. He has been emperor for 38 years. He has been awake, by the standards of anyone who has served him long enough to know his habits. For what is probably not the first long night this week, or the week before it, the document on the desk is a theological argument. He is refining a position, adding precision to language that he believes is not yet precise enough to do what he needs it to do. He has been doing something like this, in various specific forms, for the entire length of his reign, finding the word that makes the intractable tractable, finding the formulation that makes the unified thing visible to the people who are looking at the fractured thing and cannot see past the fracture. He has not found it yet. He is still looking, outside. Hagia Sophia is standing in the November dark. He cannot see it from where he is sitting, but he knows it is there, with the specific knowledge of someone who built a thing and therefore carries its presence in a way that is different from how everyone else carries it. He knows the height of the dome from the floor. He knows the number of windows at its base. He knows what the light does when it comes through those windows in the early morning, when the angle is right. Because he designed the angle, and he has seen it many times. There is one more thing in the room at 3 in the morning that is not on the desk. It is not a document. It is not a theological argument. It is not a map of Italy or a decree about legal procedure or a letter to a bishop who has not responded. It is a memory. Belisarius died in March, 8 months ago. By the time this November arrives, the man who took North Africa in a matter of months, the man who walked into Carthage through open gates and maintained discipline so completely that the local population, standing in the streets watching, had to revise everything they had been prepared to feel about a conquering army. The man who defended Rome for 14 months with forces insufficient for the task and held it anyway because he was Belisarius, and holding it was what he did. The man who was arrested in 562 on charges of conspiracy that the historical record does not support with anything like the certainty required to justify what was done to him. Justinian had filed him away for 20 years. That is the accurate description of what happened. Not the romantic one. Not the conspiratorial one. Not the version where Justinian was simply jealous of a greater man. The accurate one. He had noted, in the precise and permanent way, he noted everything that he had decided was important. What the people around him had been calculating in the weeks when the plague came and his survival was uncertain. He had noted it, and he had not acted on it, and he had continued to use Belisarius, because Belisarius was necessary. And then, in 562, he acted on it. The evidence assembled against Belisarius had the quality of evidence that has been built rather than found. The conspiracy it described was significantly smaller than the accusation required it to be. The man being accused had spent 40 years doing what he was told with resources that were consistently less than what he had explained were needed, and had produced results that were consistently more than the resources should have made possible. Justinian arrested him anyway, in 563. He released him. He restored his honors. There is no record of what was said in the restoration. No account of what either of them understood about what the arrest had meant. The restoration was a fact. The arrest was a fact. The 40 years of service that preceded both were a fact. Belisarius died 5 months after the restoration. He was somewhere in his late 50s or early 60s. He was not blinded. He was not begging in the streets. The legend that formed around him afterward, the one that needed those details, needed them because the actual story was not dramatic enough to carry the weight of what felt like a wrong of a specific and serious kind. They invented blindness because they needed a word for what they saw. Justinian has been sitting with this for 8 months. Not with guilt. Exactly. Justinian was not a man who processed things through guilt. He processed them through the gap between what he had intended and what had happened, between the correct arrangement he had been trying to achieve and the outcome the arrangement had produced. He had intended to manage a dependency that had made him uncomfortable. He had produced the arrest of the man who had made the recovery of North Africa real, who had walked into Rome, who had defended Constantinople itself with whatever was available when there was nothing better. He had filed Belisarius away as a variable to be managed. The variable had died. He is still sitting with that. The candles are lower now. The document on the desk is not finished. The theological argument he is working toward is not yet precise enough to do what it needs to do. He has been here before. Many times. He will find the word. The word is there, in the landscape of the Greek language, in some arrangement that has not yet been assembled in this order. He keeps working. Now consider what he left. The corpus juris civilis is not an artifact. It is not something that was produced in the 6th century and then superseded by better thinking in the centuries that followed. It is the foundation of the legal systems of most of the world, as the world currently operates. The French Civil Code that Napoleon commissioned in 1804 was built on Justinian's categories: the German civil code, the legal traditions of Spain and Portugal, and every country in Latin America that inherited Spanish or Portuguese governance, the legal tradition of Scotland, the canon law of the Catholic Church. When people in any of these legal traditions argue about property or contract or inheritance or obligation or the principles of civil liability, they are arguing in a language that Justinian's lawyers organized. The categories they use, the distinctions they make, the underlying structure of how they think about what law is and what it is for, were shaped by 10 men working in Constantinople in the early 500s, under impossible time pressure at the direction of an emperor, who believed that the correct organization of legal principle was the foundation of a just civilization. He was right about that. The specific things he built the foundation for are not what he intended. Roman civilization, in the sense of a unified imperial order governing the Mediterranean world from a single capital, did not survive long enough to use the legal foundation he built for it in the way he intended it to be used. The civilization that did use it was something he would not have recognized. Medieval Europe, organized around the church and the feudal system and the emerging national identities that Rome's collapse had eventually made space for, took Justinian's law and built something with it that had no resemblance to what Justinian had imagined. But the law itself traveled. It survived the empire that produced it. It survived the peoples who inherited the empire's fragments. It survived 1,000 years of European history that moved in directions no one in Constantinople in 533 could have imagined. It arrived in the modern world, still recognizable as itself, still organizing how people think about what law means and what it requires. He wanted to make Rome legible to itself. He made most of the modern world legible to itself, without knowing that was what he was doing, in a language that Rome would not have recognized as its own. Hagia Sophia is standing. This sentence requires nothing added to it. 1,500 years. The empire that built it fell in 1453, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II brought his army to the walls of Constantinople and, after a siege of 53 days, broke through them. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died in the fighting. The empire that had called itself Rome for 1,000 years after Rome ceased to govern itself ended on a Tuesday in May. Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia on the day of the conquest. He did not destroy it. He prayed in it. He ordered it converted to a mosque. The Christian mosaics were plastered over. Minarets were added to the exterior. The building that Justinian had built to be the sacred center of a unified Christian world became a mosque for the empire that had ended, the Christian empire that built it. It remained a mosque for nearly 500 years. Ataturk converted it to a museum in 1934 as part of the project of building a secular Turkish national identity from the fragments of the Ottoman Empire that the First World War had ended. In 2020, the Turkish government converted it back to a mosque. Through all of this, the dome floats above the nave exactly as Anthemius and Isidore calculated it would float. The light enters the 40 windows at the dome's base and merges before it reaches the eye, exactly as they designed it to merge. The specific quality of the silence inside, the silence that has held Christian liturgy and Muslim prayer, and the footsteps of millions of tourists, and the prayers of the simply curious and the wondering, has remained what it was when Justinian walked into it in 537 and said the thing he said to the king who had been dead for 1,500 years. He built it to be the center of something. The center it became is not the center he built it to be, but it is still a center. It is still the place that people come from, everywhere on earth, to stand inside and look up at the light that has no source and feel, before they think anything, that they are somewhere that does not follow the rules of the world outside. He wanted to make something that lasted. It lasted. The wanting was his. The lasting belongs to everyone who has stood inside it since. And Italy, 3 years after he died. The Lombards crossed the Alps. This is the fact that sits most uncomfortably in any accounting of Justinian's reign. Not because it invalidates what he built, but because it puts the cost of the building in the clearest possible terms. 20 years of warfare across the Italian peninsula. A generation of soldiers and administrators and Italian civilians who lived through the fighting and the sieges and the economic disruption of 2 decades of military campaign. The exhaustion of the empire's military and financial capacity to a degree that his successors would spend the next century trying to manage, for an Italian Italy that lasted 15 years after his death. He had wanted to make Rome whole again. The wholeness he achieved lasted, in its most fragile parts. Less time than the campaigns to achieve it had taken. The wholeness he achieved in its most permanent form, the law and the building, is still whole 1,500 years later. This is not a paradox he would have been comfortable with. The things he built as instruments of the larger project outlasted the project. The tools are still running. The purpose they were built to serve dissolved within a century of his death. He was trying to restore Rome. He restored the idea of what Rome could be, in a language that people who had never heard of the Eastern Roman Empire would use to organize their civilizations. He was trying to build the center of a unified Christian world. He built a building that has held every faith that stood in front of it. He was trying to make the broken thing whole. The broken thing did not become whole, but the attempt left behind objects of such quality and such durability that they outlasted the breaking and the wholeness and every argument that had been made about both. Is this enough? He would not have thought so. He was not a man who found consolation in unintended consequences. The legal code running in courts he had not imagined. The building serving faiths he had not endorsed. The partial recovery of territories that lasted less than the campaign to recover them. These were not the things he had been working toward. He had been working toward Rome. Rome, whole and unified and present in law and territory and faith. The Rome that he had been certain was recoverable, if you found the right words and applied sufficient will and did not stop. He did not find all the right words. He did not achieve what he was working toward. And yet, the law is running, the building is standing, and somewhere, in the November dark of 565, an old man at a desk in the largest palace ever built is still looking for the word. The candles are burning. The document is on the desk. The theological argument is not yet precise enough to do what he needs it to do. He is still writing. He will be writing when the morning comes. He will be writing when the morning after that comes, outside, in the dark. The building he made from light and mathematics is standing exactly as Anthemius and Isidore calculated it would stand. The dome floats above the nave. The light is waiting for the morning to enter through 40 windows and merge before it reaches the eye. The man at the desk does not know, and will never know, that what he built while he was looking for the word outlasted the word, that the building became the answer to a question he did not know he was asking. That 1,500 years of travelers would walk through the door he built and feel, before they thought anything, exactly what he designed them to feel. That is who he was. That is what it cost. That is what it made. The light is still there. It has no source that you can point to. It never did. That was the whole point.